Hello fellow Sapiens, and welcome to Sleepless Homo. Before we begin, take a breath. Slow your thoughts. Whether you're getting ready to sleep, driving through the night, cooking, or quietly working, this space is for that. A calm corner of the internet for tired thinkers who still wonder about deep time, ancient lives, and the small, strange facts that built our world. Here, we tell stories softly. Science, history and archaeology without noise or ego. Just humble researchers, forgotten fossils, and quiet curiosity. If you enjoy this kind of slow storytelling, consider liking and subscribing. It helps other sleepless minds find their way here. Tell me in the comments where or how you listen, before sleep, while studying, or through headphones in the dark. And if you drift off mid-episode, there are timestamps waiting when you return. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Imagine this. It is 13,000 years before today, and the Ice Age is ending slowly like the last exhale of a frozen world. The glaciers retreat, rivers swell, and wild grasses return to the hills of the Levant. In a limestone cave above what is now northern Israel, a group of humans, our distant cousins of the Natufian culture, gather around a hollowed stone basin. They are not yet farmers, not yet bound to the soil, but they are beginning to stay. Around them lie the remains of gazelle bones, pestles worn smooth, and something else, clumps of barley and wheat grains that have been soaked, mashed, and forgotten. Forgotten long enough for something invisible to happen. When archaeologists uncovered this site at 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐌𝐏𝐒, they found microscopic traces of starch granules that had burst, twisted and changed in a way that could only mean one thing: fermentation. The first beer, or something like it, had been made here, accidentally most likely, 13 millennia ago. Before writing, before pottery, even before settled agriculture, humans had already discovered how to turn grain and water into a mild, fizzy intoxication. We don't know if they called it anything. We don't even know if they thought of it as drink or food. But it mattered enough to leave traces in the archaeological record, and that alone is extraordinary. To understand how such an accident could happen, you have to picture the rhythm of that age. These were not yet farmers, but hunter-gatherers living through a world in transition. The wild cereals of the Levant were abundant at the end of the Pleistocene, and groups like the Natufians had learned to harvest them with flint sickles. The grains were too hard to chew raw, so they soaked them in water to soften them, or pounded them into a simple porridge. If the mixture sat too long, wild yeast from the air and from the surfaces of the plants themselves began to feed on the sugars. The result was a transformation, an invisible collaboration between fungus and human curiosity. The porridge bubbled, turned slightly sour, and if tasted, carried a soft warmth that was neither food nor fire. That warmth was ethanol, and that invisible actor, the yeast Saccharomyces cerevisiae, was about to change human history. It is the same organism that makes bread rise and turns fruit into wine, but at this moment in prehistory, humans were just beginning to stumble into partnership with it. We often imagine progress as invention, but this was more like discovery through patience, through accident, through repetition. The first brewer was not a genius, but a careful observer, who noticed that old grain mixtures could make people feel strange, and perhaps more social. The evidence from 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐾𝐒𝐒 tells us that this early beer was not a drink in our modern sense. It was thick, more like a gruel, an edible brew filled with fragments of grain husk. It would have been low in alcohol, perhaps 1 or 2%, just enough to induce relaxation and light euphoria. But what made it powerful was not the strength, it was the setting. This cave was not a domestic site. No one lived there. It was a burial cave, used for ritual feasting. The people who made beer here were not brewing to survive. They were brewing to remember, to connect, and to celebrate the dead. When scientists analysed the residues from the cave's stone mortars, they found 3 stages of cereal processing, grinding, mashing, and heating, identical to the sequence of steps still used in brewing today. It suggests intentionality. Perhaps they had learned, over generations, that if you sprouted the grains first, then crushed and soaked them, the sweetness intensified. The yeast would then find more food to consume, and the transformation would be more reliable. Whether or not they understood the chemistry, they knew the pattern. And so, a new kind of knowledge began to form, Not written, not spoken, but remembered through taste and time. Some archaeologists argue that these feasts were the very reason for the emergence of agriculture. The theory goes that humans didn't start farming because they needed food. They started farming because they wanted beer. Regular brewing required regular grain, and regular grain required the tending of wild cereals near reliable water sources. Over time, that meant staying in one place longer, guarding those resources, and eventually building the first permanent settlements. It's an unsettling thought that civilization itself might have begun with a hangover, but it forces us to see the human story in less heroic terms. Not as a march toward progress, but as a slow bonding between biology, environment, and desire. Of course, we can't know for sure if that theory is right. Archaeology deals in fragments, not certainties. What we can say is that wherever humans lingered long enough to gather and grind grain, fermentation followed. It wasn't just a biochemical process, it was a social one. Drinking together meant trusting each other. It lowered barriers, softened tensions, and created rhythm in conversation. Around those first shared bowls of barley mash, the earliest human cooperation may have deepened into something more enduring, culture. In that sense, fermentation was the first technology of community. Unlike tools or weapons, it didn't divide. It dissolved boundaries between individuals, between the living and the dead, between what was edible and what was transcendent. In the warm flicker of firelight, the Natufians might have passed around this thick, sweet-sour liquid, laughing, singing, and mourning those buried nearby. Their world was small, but their gatherings were immense in meaning. For the first time they had a way to mark an occasion, not just with words or symbols, but with chemistry, a shared physiological experience that united them in body and spirit. We know that these feasts were elaborate. The bones found at Rakafet include wild cattle, gazelle, turtles, and hundreds of plant species used for decoration and food. The labour required to gather and prepare all of this was enormous, suggesting coordination and planning beyond daily survival. Beer, then, may have been both a reward and a catalyst, an indulgence that required cooperation to produce, and one that strengthened that cooperation once consumed. What fascinates scientists today is how universal this pattern became. The same invisible logic of fermentation, grain plus water plus time, appears across continents at roughly similar moments. It is as if human cognition itself was tuned to recognize and repeat this pattern wherever it emerged. Fermentation may have been our first unconscious experiment with domestication, not of plants, but of microbes. By learning to feed yeast and harvest its byproducts, humans began their first invisible alliance with another species. That alliance would eventually shape everything from bread to antibiotics. At the heart of this story lies a paradox. Fermentation depends on decay, on letting something rot just long enough to become safe again. It requires trust in transformation, patience in the face of uncertainty, and a willingness to taste the unknown. Those traits, curiosity, tolerance, memory, are what make us human. They are what allowed the Natufians to become something slightly different from their ancestors, people who didn't just gather food, but who shaped time itself. Every sip of that early beer carried within it a small victory over impermanence. Grains that would have spoiled were now preserved. A fleeting harvest could be stored in liquid form. This was not just drinkable grain, it was drinkable memory. And perhaps that is why beer endures while so many other ancient inventions have vanished. It is both nourishment and nostalgia, a reminder that even in prehistory, humans sought not only to live, but to feel alive. When we look at that hollowed basin in Rakafet Cave today, we see chemistry, anthropology, and ritual converging into one act, a community pausing to taste time. They didn't yet know what yeast was or why the mixture bubbled, but they knew that it worked, that it warmed the body and brightened the night. That simple discovery, grain plus water plus waiting, became one of the most enduring formulas in human history. And somewhere between that first accidental fermentation and the last shared sip of a ritual feast, something irreversible began. Humans realized that transformation could be beautiful, that change could be guided but not controlled. In the quiet fizz of fermenting grain, they heard the first whisper of civilization, not in the clash of tools but in the soft sound of bubbles rising from stone. Perhaps In the end, that is what we inherit from them, the instinct to gather, to share, and to let time do its work. Beer may have started as an accident, but it became a habit of hope, a way to turn waiting into warmth and loss into ritual. And if you listen closely, that first ferment still echoes in every toast, every shared drink, every small moment of connection that keeps our species from drifting apart. Imagine a small clearing beneath the slow sunrise of 12,000 years before today. The air is cooler than it will ever be again in this part of the world, still carrying the damp scent of the last ice age. Around a low fire, people gather, dozens, not hundreds, strangers and kin alike who have walked for days to reach this meeting place in the foothills between the Levant and Anatolia. They bring with them not idols or weapons, but food. Baskets of wild barley, gazelle haunches, desert figs, bitter herbs and strange, heavy stones carved for grinding. They are here for a feast, not one of survival, but of reunion. And somewhere near the centre of this ritual meal, a thick, sour-smelling drink begins to pass from hand to hand. The ancient echo of the first ferment. By this time, humans had begun to pause their wandering. The Natufian culture had already shown what it meant to stay longer than a season, building stone huts, burying their dead in the same place, and returning to that spot again and again. These gatherings were part of something deeper than hunger. They were acts of remembering, of binding people together through shared abundance. Archaeologists have found enormous quantities of animal bones at sites like Hilazon-Tahtit in Israel. Gazelles, wild cattle, even turtles, all slaughtered at once. Such excess tells a story. You don't hunt this much to survive. You hunt this much to celebrate. Feasting, in a sense, was humanity's first social contract. It was the one behaviour that forced cooperation among groups that did not live together year-round. Sharing food built trust in ways that hunting could not. And as the feast grew larger, so did the effort to sustain them. A feast required planning, storage, and above all, grain, a commodity that could be measured, divided, and kept. For the first time, people had to manage abundance. It's here that the link between beer and settlement begins to emerge. If grain was precious enough to be fermented, it had to be protected. And if fermentation took days or weeks, someone had to stay behind to tend to it. The earliest stone structures in this region, shallow storage pits, round houses, and mortars carved into bedrock, may have begun as the infrastructure of feasting. The gathering itself could be transient, but the tools stayed. The idea of home, perhaps, began with the decision to leave something behind. The biology of beer rewards patience. The yeast doesn't work on human time. It requires stillness, the waiting that hunter-gatherers rarely practiced. But once a group learned that sitting still produced something worth sharing, that time could transform simple grain into something magical, the logic of movement started to change. Staying in one place no longer meant scarcity. It meant creation. There's a quiet irony in that. The first settlements might not have been built for survival, but for celebration. The Natufian and early Anatolian sites from this period, places like Malaha and Abu Huraira, show evidence of large communal hearths and storage bins, sometimes filled with cracked grains. Some archaeologists suggest that beer was brewed in bulk for special events, not daily consumption. That means that the rhythm of these early communities might have been seasonal. Migration punctuated by festivals, long journeys anchored by reunion. The earth itself became a calendar, marked by harvests and gatherings, and beer became the flavour of time passing. Feasts were more than parties. They were social glue in a fragile world. A successful feast built alliances, encouraged intermarriage, and resolved conflicts. People from different valleys would meet, share food, exchange tools, and, most importantly, genes. This was nature's answer to inbreeding, an ancient strategy of genetic diversity dressed up as celebration. Beer, with its relaxing and communal effects, may have lowered barriers even further. A mild intoxication, a softened boundary between stranger and friend, that might have been enough to make cooperation feel natural. The chemistry of alcohol plays a quiet role here. Ethanol suppresses fear, heightens empathy, and increases social bonding through the release of oxytocin, the same hormone that connects parents to children. In a world without written treaties or formal hierarchies, this was a neurological shortcut to peace. The first treaties may not have been signed, they were shared in liquid form. What fascinates researchers is how these gatherings reshaped the landscape itself. Around feasting sites, wild barley and wheat began to change subtly. Larger seeds, less brittle husks, signs of early human selection. It wasn't agriculture yet, not in the deliberate sense, but it was tending. Humans started noticing which patches of grass produced the best grain, which seeds thrived near the hearth. They returned to those places, trampled the soil, dropped leftover grains, and unintentionally began cultivation. Beer might not have made us farmers directly, but it taught us that transformation could be sustained. This period, the late Epipaleolithic into the early Neolithic, marks the dawn of semi-sedentism. Families began storing food for the next feast. Clay-lined pits and stone-lined silos became common. In some sites, crushed barley and wheat residues suggest both cooking and brewing. The difference between a meal and a ritual drink was becoming cultural, not chemical. Beer may have been the bridge between the two, a shared expression of patience, memory, and transformation. To sit in one place long enough for yeast to work meant something had changed in the human mind. For countless millennia, survival had depended on movement, follow the herds, chase the seasons, never linger too long. But now, patience itself was a resource. Waiting became a virtue. In the same way that fermentation transforms raw grain into something richer, stillness transformed human life into something deeper. We often think of civilization as the product of necessity, a solution to scarcity. But what if it began with abundance? What if humans first stayed because they wanted to share, not because they had to store? Beer, in this sense, may have been humanity's first economic experiment, a resource that could be made, traded and given, but only if everyone participated. It demanded collaboration long before currency existed. By 10,000 years before the present, the rhythm of human life had already changed. The last great ice sheets had retreated, and the Fertile Crescent was warming. The feasts that once marked reunion now marked belonging. Communities began to cluster near water sources, and their gatherings became more regular, their storage pits deeper, their architecture more permanent. The idea of here was taking root. Archaeologists can trace this transition through the microtraces left behind. The shift from temporary shelters to stone foundations, from shared fires to fixed hearths. But behind every layer of soil lies a simpler truth. These people had begun to organize time around one another. A feast was no longer a coincidence, it was an institution. The social calendar was born, and it tasted faintly of fermented grain. It's hard not to see the poetry in this. The same chemical process that turns grain into alcohol also turns isolation into community. Fermentation requires a balance. Too much heat, and it dies. Too little, and it never begins. Society works the same way. The feasts of the late Pleistocene taught us how to calibrate that balance. Give enough to others that they'll return. Keep enough that you can host again. This reciprocity, not technology, may have been the first foundation of civilization, and somewhere amid those gatherings, someone must have realized something profound, that the world could be abundant if people agreed to make it so. You didn't have to chase the next hunt if you could store grain. You didn't have to fear your neighbor if you could share a drink. Staying put wasn't the end of freedom. It was the beginning of trust. The first hearths, the first storage pits, the first clusters of huts. All of them can be seen as side effects of the same human instinct that first drew people to a feast. To gather, to share, to repeat. That repetition became settlement. Over generations, the intervals between feasts shortened until permanence became the default. The first villages were not cities of ambition, but circles of memory. In the glow of that slow dawn, as the world warmed and humans learned the art of staying, the taste of beer must have carried an emotion we can still recognize. The comfort of returning, of recognizing faces, of belonging somewhere even for a few days. In that brief calm between migrations, humanity found the rhythm it had been missing. So, did beer make us stop moving? Perhaps not alone, but it gave us a reason to pause long enough to imagine the possibility. To discover that stillness could be fertile, that waiting could be communal, and that sometimes the most transformative inventions are not the tools we use, but the moments we choose to share. 10,000 years before the first city walls rose, before kings, before writing, a crowd gathers beneath the stars of Upper Mesopotamia. The air smells of wet limestone and roasted grain. Fires flicker between towering stone pillars, each carved with wild animals, foxes, boars, vultures, creatures that no longer roam nearby. Drums or stones beat a slow rhythm, echoing off the plateau. People have come from miles away, dozens of groups, hundreds of individuals, speaking different dialects, carrying food, tools and stories. They stand before something immense, concentric circles of carved stone, 10 times older than the pyramids, 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐌𝐏𝐒, the first known monumental site on Earth. And at its centre, not an altar of sacrifice or throne of rule, but a series of limestone vats, their interior still stained with chemical traces of barley, calcium oxalate, and yeast residue. The earliest evidence, some say, of a communal brewery. If 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐌𝐏𝐒 was the birthplace of fermentation, 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐼 was where that knowledge became spectacle. By 9,600 years before the present, people here were still hunters, not yet farmers. Yet they carved pillars weighing 10 to 20 tons, arranging them in great rings on a mountaintop. It was a collective act that defies our assumptions about primitive humans. Something extraordinary had to bring so many people together for so long, and it might not have been religion alone. Archaeologists excavating the site uncovered large limestone basins, some big enough to hold hundreds of litres of liquid, cut directly into the bedrock. Chemical analysis revealed a crusty mineral called beer stone, the byproduct of repeated boiling and fermenting of grain. In modern breweries, beer stone forms in vats, where hot mash meets barley enzymes. For such deposits to appear 10,000 years ago suggests not an accident, but a system. These people were brewing, intentionally and at scale. The discovery raised an ancient question. What was 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐼 for? For decades, archaeologists assumed it was a temple, a sanctuary where early humans first began to organize spiritual life. But perhaps those categories, temple, brewery, feast, were not yet separate. Norman Ohler, the writer and historian who has studied the site, offers a provocative thought. Maybe these monumental circles were not houses of worship, but stages for the first great communal parties. Not chaos, but celebration as cooperation. A place where scattered groups of hunter-gatherers gathered to renew the social fabric through food, intoxication, and alliance. In that sense, 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐼 could be seen not as the dawn of organised religion, but the dawn of organised community. Feasts here might have lasted for days or weeks, powered by grain-based drinks, shared hunting and storytelling. Excavations have revealed thousands of animal bones, aurochs, gazelle and wild boar, slaughtered in mass quantities far beyond what a local group could eat alone. This was not subsistence, this was ceremony. If the first ferments bound families together, this was a new scale of bonding. To build something like 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐼 required not only shared labour, but shared motivation, a unifying force powerful enough to make people haul megaliths across a barren ridge. Some scientists believe alcohol provided that force, both literally and symbolically. The biochemical effects of beer, the lowering of inhibitions, the mild euphoria, the synchronization of mood, can transform a crowd into a collective. When the drink flows, hierarchy blurs, strangers become kin, and cooperation feels natural. For thousands of years before this, humanity had no kings, no rulers, no armies. People organized through mutual need, not command. Ohler suggests that the introduction of beer into these large-scale gatherings might have been the turning point. Fermentation allowed surplus required storage. Storage demanded control. Someone had to guard the grain, manage its preparation, and decide when and how it was shared. What began as a celebration of equality may have quietly planted the seeds of hierarchy, but before hierarchy hardened, it must have felt like magic. Imagine the scene. Hundreds of people dancing around stone rings, torches casting shadows across the carved animals. Music made from bones, flutes echoing through the night. The vats of barley mash bubbling gently nearby, tended by those who knew the rhythm of fermentation by feel, not by formula. For them, it wasn't chemistry, it was life transformed. Yeast, invisible and mysterious, was the first domesticated microorganism, though nobody knew it. Its presence turned gatherings into rituals and strangers into friends. The process must have seemed divine. Grain and water left to sit, visited by unseen spirits that made it fizz and warm, turning the bitterness of toil into sweetness. If there was a religion here, perhaps it was fermentation itself. As the parties repeated over centuries, they likely shaped more than architecture. They shaped genetics. Populations mingled at these feasts, exchanging not only goods and ideas, but DNA. In an age when small groups risked inbreeding, places like 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒 acted as evolutionary crossroads. People met partners from distant valleys, merging lineages and diversifying the human gene pool. Feasting was biology disguised as culture. To see 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒 today is to glimpse the mind of a species discovering its collective self. The carved animals, lions, scorpions, serpents, may not be gods at all, but symbols of memory, reminders of hunts and feasts shared long ago. Each pillar could have represented a group or clan that returned season after season. The circles themselves might have been meeting places, each ring a neighbourhood in humanity's first great reunion. The labour required to create them is staggering. The builders lacked metal tools, wheels, or domesticated animals, yet they quarried and transported massive stones, carving them with precise reliefs. To coordinate such work implies something beyond survival, a shared reason to build. Beer, in this view, was not an indulgence but a social technology. It allowed emotion, trust, and cooperation to scale up. In modern neuroscience, ethanol's ability to reduce anxiety and increase sociability is well documented. The same mechanism that drives modern social drinking may have once powered collective architecture. When we picture the birth of civilization, we imagine order emerging from chaos. Leaders taming crowds, rules replacing instincts. But 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒 flips that script. Here, order may have emerged from celebration itself. People came for the feast, and in doing so, learned how to organise. Rituals of sharing became rehearsals for governance. The communal rhythm of brewing became a prototype for administration, and in time, as Ola suggests, the keepers of the vats became the keepers of authority. Archaeologically, this is where we begin to see the first hints of inequality. Some areas of the site contain finer carvings, carefully arranged offerings, and restricted access. Not everyone was allowed everywhere. The feast that once united may have begun to divide. The symbolic centre, the vat, the ring, the stone, started to belong to a few rather than all. The privilege of organising the feast turned into the power of defining its rules. Even the act of closing 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒, around 8,000 years before the present, seems deliberate. The circles were buried carefully, layer by layer, as if retiring a chapter of human life. When the site was abandoned, new settlements began to rise across Mesopotamia and Anatolia, places where people no longer met for brief celebrations but lived year-round, storing grain, domesticating animals, and formalising rituals. The spirit of 𝐓𝐈𝐿𝐄𝐒 moved from mountain to village, from feast to faith. We can only speculate about the conversations that took place there. The site predates writing by millennia, so the story is carved only in stone and residue. But it's enough to see a pattern. Before the temple, there was the party. Before religion, there was rhythm. Before hierarchy, there was hospitality. This doesn't mean the builders were hedonists. To them, celebration was sacred because it bound life to continuity. Every brew connected them to the soil, the grain, and the invisible world of transformation. They may have believed that in mixing barley, water, and time, they were participating in a cosmic process, something that turned mortality into renewal. In that sense, the first beers were not just drinks, they were metaphors for life itself. Standing in the shadow of those ancient pillars, it's hard not to wonder if the story of civilization began with a misunderstanding of pleasure. What began as communion, literal physical communion, evolved into structure. The organisers of the feast became its rulers, the hosts of the brew became its priests. And the drink that once dissolved barriers began, paradoxically, to build them again. We can't be sure what exactly was mixed in those vats. Barley, einkorn, wild wheat, or something else entirely. We don't know the songs they sang or the names they used for their gatherings, but we can sense the emotion that drew them back. The warmth of company, the comfort of shared intoxication, the relief of being human among humans. Maybe that's the true origin story here. Not a monument to gods, but to each other. So, was 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐌𝐏𝐒 built to worship, or to party? The evidence suggests it might have been both. A celebration so grand it blurred the line between devotion and joy. A place where the first architecture rose not to command the heavens, but to hold a crowd together long enough for yeast to finish its work. Imagine this, a clay jar, half buried in the dust of the Zagros Mountains, its surface faintly glazed with time. Inside it, a ghostly film of calcium oxalate clings to the inner wall, the silent fingerprint of fermentation. It is 7,000 years before the present, and somewhere in the high valleys of what is now western Iran, people are beginning to do something astonishingly complex. They are turning grain, water and time into something that can be stored, counted and exchanged. They may not have words for economy or chemistry, but they are performing both. The story of civilization's first numbers begins not with coins or kings, but with beer. The site where this story emerges is Godin Tepe, a small settlement perched between mountains and river valleys along ancient trade routes. Excavations there uncovered fragments of pottery, ordinary to the eye, extraordinary under a microscope. When scientists analysed these shards, they found unmistakable traces of beer residue. The jars were large, thick-walled, and sometimes sealed with reed stoppers, suggesting they held liquids meant to last weeks or months. These were not feasting vessels, they were storage units, and their contents, once foaming and golden, mark one of humanity's earliest known moments of biochemical precision. By this time, people across the Fertile Crescent had begun domesticating cereals, barley, wheat and emmer, and the act of brewing was no longer a seasonal experiment. It was infrastructure. Barley, after all, was a grain that could be measured by volume and weight, and its transformation into beer made it both consumable and preservable. Once brewed, it became something rare in early economies, a product that could be made ahead of time, distributed, and stored without spoiling quickly. In a world still learning the value of planning, beer was time itself captured in liquid form. The chemical process was intricate but repeatable. Grains were soaked, germinated, dried, and mashed, then mixed with warm water to extract sugars. Wild yeasts, floating invisibly in the air or carried on the surface of the grain, began to convert those sugars into alcohol. The result was a drink that was safer than untreated water, more nutritious than plain grain, and, importantly, shareable. To brew beer was to create stability out of chaos. You could feed a village not just for a day, but for a season. Yet something new was happening here, something beyond the chemical. For the first time, humans began keeping track. Archaeologists at nearby Neolithic sites have found small clay tokens, cones, discs, spheres, each marked with tiny impressions. They appear to represent quantities of grain, jars, or livestock. Many of these were found in association with pottery and storage rooms. To manage beer, it turns out, you needed math. These marks, simple, repetitive, consistent, may be the ancestors of writing. Before words, there were measures. Before stories, there were tallies of grain and drink. Beer became a kind of proto-currency. It could be portioned, traded, or offered as payment for labour. Unlike meat, it was not perishable. Unlike grain, it was enjoyable. The same process that made it intoxicating also made it equitable. In this sense, the phrase liquid bread, found much later in ancient texts, may reflect a truth already forming in the late Neolithic mind, that beer was both nourishment and number. Each jar carried calories, comfort, and value. To control beer, you had to understand consistency. Temperature, time, and cleanliness suddenly mattered. This required containers, clay, not skin or stone. The invention of pottery changed everything. Fired clay could hold heat evenly, resist spoilage, and seal flavour. More importantly, it could be standardised. 2 jars of similar shape could hold roughly the same volume, which made them countable. Thus, pottery wasn't just an artistic leap, it was an accounting tool. When a jar was filled, marked, and stored, it represented not just sustenance, but responsibility. Someone had to keep track. At sites across Iran, northern Mesopotamia and Anatolia, archaeologists have found rooms lined with similar vessels. Some contain residues of barley malt and starch granules, others show layered residues from multiple uses, as if refilled over time. It's possible these were communal stores, managed by families or clans. To distribute beer fairly, people had to remember who contributed what, who received how much, and when the next batch would be ready. The very logic of brewing invited record-keeping, and once humans began to record, they began to abstract. The clay tokens that represented jars eventually evolved into impressions made directly on clay tablets. These impressions, the earliest precursors of writing, are thought to have tracked commodities like grain, oil, and beer. Each mark was a promise, a memory externalized. Civilization, in this quiet sense, began not with architecture or armies, but with the need to remember who owed whom a drink. This merging of chemistry and counting may be the earliest form of data management. Every batch of beer was an experiment in process control. Too warm and the brew soured, too cold and fermentation stalled. Brewing required observation, repetition, and a basic understanding of cause and effect. In short, it required science. You could almost call these early brewers the first empirical thinkers. They didn't measure with rulers or equations, but with taste, smell, and time. They learned by iteration, one jar at a time. There's also an evolutionary angle to this. Beer, with its mild alcohol content, offered a safe source of hydration in regions where water could carry pathogens. Populations that learned to ferment safely had a survival advantage. Some anthropologists even proposed that the craving for alcohol shaped human metabolism, that our species evolved a unique efficiency at processing ethanol precisely because of these ancient habits. The enzyme ADH4, which allows us to digest alcohol, shows a major adaptive shift roughly 10 million years ago in our primate ancestors. But its cultural expression, the choice to ferment, became truly human only here, in these valleys of clay and barley. Imagine the social scenes this new skill enabled. Within small settlements like 𝐓�/𝐻𝐿𝐻𝐻, the act of brewing became routine. Neighbours might gather to help mash grains, seal jars, and wait. The process created shared rhythms, days marked by tasks, weeks by fermentation cycles, months by seasonal harvests. Life began to acquire a mathematical pulse. Brewing was both biological and temporal, a way of keeping time before calendars existed. This regularity carried profound psychological consequences. Once people began thinking in terms of cycles, brew, ferment, drink, repeat, they could imagine the future in measurable units. Time became predictable. And from predictability came planning, and from planning came complexity. The logic of civilization was, in a sense, brewed before it was written. By the late 6th millennium before the present, the region was dotted with small farming communities. Each had its own storage systems, pottery designs, and brewing traditions. Beer was becoming regionalized, with variations in flavour and technique reflecting local grains and water sources. Some sites show evidence of communal brewing, others of household-scale production. But the pattern was clear. Fermentation had become identity. To make beer a certain way was to belong somewhere. Still, this new control came with subtle shifts in power. Whoever managed the storage controlled the distribution. Whoever marked the clay decided the value. It was a small step from measuring to managing, from remembering to ruling. These early brewers and record keepers may not have been kings, but they were the ancestors of administration. Through beer, the first bureaucrats were born. There is a quiet irony here. The same drink that once dissolved hierarchy at 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐻𝐒 was now giving rise to it. Not through force, but through organisation. The need to coordinate resources, balance accounts, and preserve trust required structure. And structure in turn required those who specialised in keeping order. Civilization, as it turns out, did not emerge from conquest but from collaboration, and from the need to keep the yeast alive. What makes this story so humbling is how much we still don't know. The traces of beer at 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐻𝐒 are chemical whispers, the residue of lives lived without words. We can only reconstruct their logic from fragments of clay and stone. Yet those fragments carry the essence of what would become civilization's defining traits: storage, record, exchange. When people learn to count jars, they learn to think abstractly. And abstraction, More than architecture was the seed of the modern mind. So when did beer become mathematics? Perhaps when the first brewer realised that 10 jars of grain could yield 9 jars of drink, or when someone etched a line into clay to remember that number. In that moment, intoxication met abstraction, and the foundation of history was laid, not in blood or conquest, but in yeast and patience. Imagine this. A woman in ancient Sumer, 4,000 years before your time, kneels beside a clay vat bubbling softly in the heat. Around her the air smells of wet barley and sweet fermentation. She is reciting something. Not a prayer exactly, not a recipe either, but both. The words rise and fall like the rhythm of work, a chant shaped by breath and memory. Ninkasi, you are the one who waters the malt, who soaks the grain, who spreads the mash upon the great reed mats. Each verse describes a step. Each breath transforms labour into ritual. This is the hymn to Ninkasi, one of humanity's oldest surviving poems, and perhaps the first piece of literature to double as a set of instructions. It is a song for a goddess of beer, but also for the hands that made it. The hymn comes from Sumer, a civilization built on the floodplains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Around the early 2nd millennium before the present, when cuneiform tablets had already filled temples with grain accounts and legal decrees, someone decided that beer, too, deserved words of its own. The verses were written in praise of Ninkasi, literally the lady who fills the mouth. She was not a goddess of drunkenness or excess, but of process and transformation. Her name appeared in temple lists alongside those of grain deities, bread makers, and river spirits. She was both a divine brewer and the symbol of a craft that sustained the entire urban world. The hymn's lines read like the world's earliest brewing manual. They describe malting barley by soaking it, drying it on reed mats, and mashing it with sweet aromatics like honey and dates. The resulting mixture was boiled and left to ferment in large vats, probably open to the air, where wild yeast would begin its invisible work. Once ready, it was poured into collector jars, filtered through straw, and finally consumed as sikru, the Sumerian term meaning liquid bread. Archaeologists believe the hymn served both as liturgy and as instruction, an oral guide recited by priestesses who oversaw the temple breweries. For in Sumer, brewing was not a private affair. It was a sacred and economic institution. The great temples of cities like Uruk, Lagash and Nippur functioned as both spiritual centres and production complexes. Inside their courtyards, rows of large brewing vats stood beside granaries and bakeries. Teams of women, often referred to in records as lukanda or brewmistresses, managed these operations. They were paid in grain and beer, and the products they made flowed out through the temple's administrative system to feed workers, priests and soldiers. Beer, in this system, was not a luxury, it was salary. Clay tablets from around the same period list rations distributed in jars of sikru, the amount varying by status and role. A labourer might receive 2 litres a day, a senior worker, perhaps 3 or 4. Even children and the elderly had their allotted share. It was food, hydration and community in one. The state, or rather the temple, literally ran on beer, and because it could be standardised and stored, it became the most reliable form of sustenance in a region where fresh water was dangerous to drink. The process of making beer also mirrored the rhythms of Mesopotamian life itself. Grain harvested from irrigated fields was brought to the city, catalogued by scribes, then transformed into bread or drink under divine supervision. The hymn to Ninkasi captured that sequence in poetic form. It was both a recipe and a worldview, a metaphor for the ordered cosmos that Sumerians believed the gods had given them. Brewing was an act of stability in a world of floods and droughts, a controlled version of the chaos that surrounded them. The presence of women at the heart of this process is not incidental. Across Sumerian and later Akkadian records, female brewers are named and honoured, sometimes even depicted on cylinder seals. They were respected artisans within the temple hierarchy. Some scholars have suggested that Ninkasi herself may have originated as a deified memory of these women, a symbolic recognition of their social importance. To make beer was to sustain life, and to control its distribution was to wield power. Consider what it meant for a society to give fermentation a face, to personify yeast as a goddess. It suggests a kind of reverence not for the drink itself, but for the invisible process behind it. the transformation of grain, water, and time into something alive. The hymn praises Ninkasi for holding with both hands the great sweet wort, for pouring it like the onrush of the Tigris and the Euphrates. In those lines, beer becomes a microcosm of creation, an echo of the rivers that fed the land. Fermentation was divine order made tangible. The hymn to Ninkasi also shows us how early science hid inside early religion. Every verse encodes observation, which ingredients to use, how long to soak them, how to judge readiness by sound, smell, or sight. When it says the fermenting vat makes a pleasant sound, that may describe the bubbling of carbon dioxide during yeast activity. The words are devotional, but the knowledge is empirical. Reciting the hymn was both worship and quality control. In this way, the poem stands at the crossroads of chemistry and theology, the first brewing manual written as music. There's a quiet beauty in this synthesis. To sing the steps of brewing was to preserve them, ensuring that each generation could replicate the process without written formulas. And yet, the hymn also reflects a worldview in which productivity and piety were inseparable. The temple was both brewery and bureaucracy, both kitchen and cosmos. By praising Ninkasi, a brewer affirmed their role within the divine order, just as the yeast confirmed its role in turning sugar to spirit. The Sumerian word sikaru captures this duality perfectly. It meant liquid bread, emphasizing that beer was not a drink apart from food, but an extension of it. Bread fed the body, beer nourished both body and spirit. Together they formed the foundation of the Sumerian diet. Archaeological residues from vats and drinking vessels show that their beer was thick, nutritious, and cloudy, more like a porridge than the clear beverages of today. It was sipped through long reed straws from communal jars, often in groups. This shared consumption reinforced equality and trust. In a society that understood hierarchy, beer was the rare leveller. But in another sense, beer also maintained hierarchy. The temple controlled its production and rations, tying devotion to dependence. Workers drank because the gods, through their administrators, allowed them to. It was gratitude, not entitlement. This arrangement may have been one of the first examples of centralized food control, a precursor to organized governance. Through Ninkasi, power and piety became intertwined. If one reads the hymn to Ninkasi closely, there is something else between the lines. Joy. It is not a dirge or a command, but a celebration. The verses pulse with rhythm and pleasure. It is you who pour out the filtered beer of the collector vat, it concludes. It is like the onrush of the Tigris and the Euphrates. To the Sumerians, beer was the world distilled. The rivers, the harvest, the heat of the sun, all brought together in a single act of creation. To drink it was to taste civilization itself. We can only imagine the scene where such a hymn was performed. Perhaps a small chorus of women in a temple courtyard, their hands stained with malt, their hair tied back with reeds, chanting to keep time as they stirred the vats. Perhaps a high priestess leading the ritual, invoking Ninkasi not to bless the drink, but to remind them of the sacred rhythm of labour. The air would have been heavy with the scent of fermentation and honey, the ground wet with spilled wort. In that moment, humanity had turned chemistry into culture. And maybe that is what it truly means when a drink earns its own goddess. It means it has become more than a chemical reaction or a social custom. It has become meaning itself. Beer, in Sumer, was not just sustenance, it was narrative. Every jar told a story about cooperation, order, and gratitude. The hymn to Ninkasi was humanity learning to thank a process. Thousands of years later, when archaeologists first translated the hymn from its clay tablet, they were struck by its detail and its warmth. It is a reminder that even in a civilization so far removed from our own, people found reverence in the everyday act of making something together. The Sumerians didn't just drink to forget. They brewed to remember the river cycles, the harvests, the hands that mixed the mash. So when you hear the name Ninkasi, don't think of excess or escapism. Think of balance, of gratitude, of the first recognition that transformation, whether biological or spiritual, deserves acknowledgement. Somewhere between those reed mats and clay vats, between the hymn and the bubbling wort, a quiet truth emerged. That civilization began not with conquest or law, but with fermentation and song. Imagine this: the morning sun rising over the edge of the desert striking gold against limestone, thousands of workers stir awake near the Giza Plateau. The air hums with the low sounds of footsteps, wooden sledges, and distant hammers striking stone, and beside the pyramids, not far from where the dead will one day rest, stand long rows of vats, jars, and clay jugs lined with drying barley. The smell is unmistakable, sweet, sour, and faintly alive. Egypt's pyramids, the largest human monuments of the ancient world, were not built on bread or coin, they were built on beer. In the Old Kingdom, between roughly 3,000 and 2,000 years before the Common Era, Egypt's state functioned not on currency but on rations. Grain and beer were the economy's bloodstream. Each worker, from quarrymen to stone haulers to craftsmen, received their pay not in gold but in 𝐓𝐾𝐒𝐌𝐏𝐒, a thick, nourishing beer that sustained life along the Nile. Archaeologists have found that even those who worked the massive pyramid projects consumed as much as 4 litres per day, not as indulgence, but as necessity. The reason was simple. The Nile was beautiful, but it was not clean. Water drawn directly from it carried parasites and microbes that caused severe illness. Beer, on the other hand, was boiled during brewing, making it far safer to drink. The mild alcohol content, usually no higher than 2 to 3%, acted as an antimicrobial barrier. In a world before modern sanitation, fermentation was public health. To imagine this system, we have to step into the village at Giza, known today as 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿. Archaeologists call it the lost city of the pyramid builders. Excavations reveal rows of long bakery breweries, rectangular chambers filled with conical vats made of clay. Inside each vat, grains of barley and emmer wheat were soaked, malted, mashed, and fermented. Nearby, circular pits were used to grind grain or dry it in the sun. The scale was astonishing. Thousands of litres brewed every day, enough to feed and hydrate a small city. The process itself was elegant in its simplicity. Barley and emmer were soaked until they germinated, activating enzymes that converted starch into sugar. The malt was then sun-dried and crushed, mixed with more raw grain, and heated into a porridge-like mash. Once cooled, it was placed in large ceramic jars to ferment with wild yeast, the same microbial allies that humans had unknowingly partnered with for millennia. These yeasts, naturally present on grain husks and in the air, turned the sugar-rich mash into a bubbly, mildly alcoholic drink. The Egyptians learned to reuse this yeast-rich sediment, scooping it from the bottom of old jars to seed the next batch, a quiet early mastery of microbiology long before anyone could see it. When fresh, the beer was thick, almost chewable. To modern eyes, it would resemble a liquid bread pudding more than a drink. Its colour was a cloudy golden brown, rich with vitamins, calories, and fibre. In the Egyptian language, the word for beer, 𝐓𝐾𝐒𝐌𝐿, was also the name of a goddess associated with fertility and renewal. To drink beer was not to intoxicate, but to live. The labourers who hauled stones, the women grinding grain, the scribes tallying deliveries, all were fuelled by the same brew. Ancient administrative documents and carvings show just how organised this system was. Beer and bread were produced in exact ratios, recorded meticulously by scribes on clay tablets and ostraca. A worker might receive 3 to 4 jugs per day depending on his role, while higher-ranking overseers received more potent or finely strained varieties. The ration lists found in tombs show that even in death, Egyptians expected their supply of beer to continue. Many tombs included model breweries, miniature scenes of workers pouring malt, stirring mash and filling jars, so the deceased could enjoy eternal sustenance in the afterlife. These were not slaves in chains, as popular imagination once held, but a managed labour force, skilled, organised, and paid in liquid bread. Beer, in a very real sense, was what kept the pyramids rising. Archaeological studies of skeletal remains from workers' cemeteries show that they were well fed and healthy for the time. They suffered the expected wear of physical labour, but signs of malnutrition were rare. Beer was their steadying foundation, their energy source, and their daily medicine. The breweries themselves were feats of early industrial design. In some sites like Abydos and Hierakonpolis, archaeologists have uncovered entire complexes devoted to brewing, capable of producing thousands of litres in a single run. Each consisted of rows of clay vats set in shallow brick frames. Fires were kindled beneath them to control temperature, while the mash was stirred continuously with long wooden paddles. Once fermentation was complete, the beer was transferred into large transport jars, each sealed with mud and stamped with the symbol of the overseeing household or temple. Some of these jars still bear faint impressions of the brewer's name or the hieroglyph for 𝐓𝐻𝐾𝐌𝐏𝐻𝐒, proof of Egypt's ancient supply chains. This mass production of beer was more than a practical innovation. It represented an entirely new way of structuring society. Brewing linked farmers, craftsmen, priests and administrators in a continuous loop of exchange. Barley harvested in the fields became rations for workers. The labour of those workers, in turn, built monuments that celebrated the state's divine power. In this sense, beer was not just food, it was infrastructure. Every vat was a miniature economy, every batch an act of civic devotion. We often think of the pyramids as symbols of divine ambition, but they were also monuments to logistics. To maintain the flow of materials, labour and sustenance, the Egyptians developed one of the earliest large-scale supply systems in history. Beer functioned as both nutrition and currency, a unit of value as stable as the sun that rose over the Nile. A worker could count his contribution to the pyramid in jugs consumed, each one a small reward for strength given. Even art reflected this connection between labour, piety and drink. Wall paintings show offering tables piled with loaves and beer jars, presented to both gods and the dead. In many depictions, beer is poured alongside water as an essential offering, not a luxury. It was the drink of both kings and farmers, the bridge between divine and mortal sustenance. What's remarkable is how much attention the Egyptians paid to the craft itself. Brewing recipes were passed down through generations, and variations existed for taste and purpose. There were lighter beers for daily consumption, and richer, sweeter brews for festivals or temple offerings. The workers' 𝐓𝐻𝐾𝐌𝐏𝐒 was more practical, thicker, and unfiltered. The priestly beer might have been clearer and higher in alcohol. Each type reflected the balance between necessity and ceremony. And there is something profound about that balance. Brewing by its very nature is transformation, a controlled decay turned into nourishment. It embodies the cycle of life and death, rot and renewal. For the Egyptians, who saw their entire world as a rhythm of rebirth, of floods and harvests, of sunrise and sunset, beer must have felt like the most tangible form of that cosmic order. The yeast that consumed the sugars and released bubbles of life was, to them, another expression of divine continuity. Some scholars even suggest that the goddess 𝐓𝐻𝐾𝐌𝐏𝐻𝐒, often depicted as a frog and associated with fertility, lent her name to beer precisely because of this symbolism. Frogs appeared with the flooding Nile, signalling new life. Beer likewise appeared with each harvest, reviving the people who depended on it. In that way, every batch was an act of faith in the river's return. One can imagine the end of a long workday at Giza, the air cooling, dust settling, the workers gathered by the breweries. Each receives their rations, a jug of beer and some bread, and they sit in groups, talking, laughing, drinking together. Beyond them, the pyramid's shadow stretches long across the sand, its surface still glowing with the sun's last light. The scene is humble but immense, a civilization sustained not by conquest, but by cooperation, by the quiet miracle of fermentation repeated day after day. When modern archaeologists first analysed the residues inside Egyptian beer jars, they found the telltale chemical signatures of maltose sugars and yeast byproducts. The same molecular traces appear in the jars of workers' towns and in the tombs of nobles. Beer, it seems, flowed through every layer of Egyptian society. It was a shared human thread, from the builders to the pharaoh himself, and perhaps that is why the pyramids still stand. They were not built by divine will alone, nor by forced labour, but by communities bound together through sustenance and ritual. Each stone placed was, in its own way, a toast to survival, to continuity, to the strange alchemy that turns grain and time into life. When we raise a glass today, we echo that same act, unaware that our gesture descends from the hands that once lifted clay jugs beneath the Egyptian sun. Somewhere between hunger and ingenuity, between survival and celebration, those early brewers found a way to make civilization drinkable. Long before anyone spoke of empires or gods, before trade routes crossed oceans or writing-shaped clay, humans everywhere were doing the same strange, miraculous thing. On opposite ends of the planet, under entirely different skies, People were watching their food come alive. Grain soaked in water, fruit left too long in the sun, a pot sealed and forgotten. Across thousands of miles the same invisible transformation unfolded. Sugars turned to bubbles, liquid to warmth, and the line between hunger and happiness blurred. It didn't matter if the vessel was carved from bamboo or clay, if the drink came from rice or millet or maize. Every culture that ever existed seems to have rediscovered the same ancient secret. Fermentation works anywhere life exists. By around 3,000 years before the Common Era, this quiet science had spread to nearly every continent where humans lived. In the fertile valleys of China, along the winding rivers of sub-Saharan Africa, in the high Andes of South America, and across the warm deltas of South Asia, people were independently discovering how to turn grain and fruit into something more than food. It was not a technology that needed to be traded. It was one the planet itself kept whispering to us. In China's Yellow River Basin, early farmers who had long grown millet and rice were already mastering a range of fermented beverages known collectively as 𝐓𝐿. Archaeologists at sites like 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 have found pottery vessels bearing chemical traces of rice, honey and fruit fermentation, dating back even earlier, nearly 9,000 years ago. But by the 3rd millennium BCE, the process had become deliberate, refined and deeply cultural. The brewers of early China used natural molds to break down starches, creating a starter mash not unlike modern 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒. These molds, complex communities of yeast and filamentous fungi, were added to steamed rice or millet, which was then sealed in clay jars. Over time, the mixture fermented into a light, sweet-sour beverage that could range from cloudy and thick to pale and clear. It wasn't just refreshment, it was ritual. In the earliest Chinese dynasties, offerings of 𝐓𝐿 were poured to ancestors and spirits, its rising vapours carrying prayers into the unseen. To drink was to remember, and to remember was to keep the dead among the living. Meanwhile, across the African continent, people were shaping their own partnerships with yeast. Along the savannas and river valleys, grain beers made from millet and sorghum became staples of diet and ceremony. The method was simple but ingenious. Grains were soaked, germinated and ground into a mash, then lightly cooked and left to ferment with wild yeast. The result was a rich porridge-like beer, often thick enough to eat with a spoon. In places like ancient Nubia, residues of such brews have been found in pottery nearly as old as Egypt's Old Kingdom. Later traditions across Central and East Africa developed variations that still exist today, such as tella in Ethiopia and pito in West Africa. These were not luxury drinks but daily sustenance, dense with nutrition. A single bowl could contain enough calories to sustain a worker through the day. Yet the act of brewing was always communal. Women often controlled the process, preparing the mash for harvest feasts, weddings and funerals. In many regions, fermented grain drinks were used to welcome guests, seal agreements and mark seasons. The first sip was shared with the ancestors, poured to the ground, acknowledging that the yeast was older than all of them. Far to the east, another kind of fermentation was thriving in the humid tropics of Southeast Asia. Here, the drink came from palms. People learned to cut into the stalks of coconut, date or oil palms to collect the sweet sap that oozed out. Within hours, natural yeast from the air transformed the sugary liquid into a gently effervescent drink known as palm toddy. It was low in alcohol but rich in flavour, alive with microscopic activity. Every village had its palm and its tapper, and the drink was consumed fresh each morning before it could turn sour. The process required precision and patience, a kind of daily contract with nature. The palm gave just enough to sustain, never too much to destroy. Across the Pacific in the Americas, humans had also discovered the yeast waiting in the air. Along the Andes, long before the rise of the Inca, people brewed chicha from maize. The process began with an act of transformation both literal and symbolic. Women chewed kernels of corn and spat the pulp into a communal pot. The enzymes in saliva began to break down starches into sugars, creating the conditions yeast needed to thrive. This wasn't superstition, it was chemistry, embodied. The mash was left to ferment into a mildly intoxicating beer, cloudy, thick, and sweet. Chicha was the drink of festivals, offerings, and diplomacy. It was brewed for births and deaths, used to greet strangers, and poured to honour the mountains and the earth. In the Andes, to refuse a cup of chicha was to reject friendship itself. Even in North America, where maize-based fermentation was rarer, indigenous peoples made regional variations from fruit, honey, and sap. In what is now Mexico, agave sap was fermented into a drink known as pulque, milky, tangy, and sacred to the gods of fertility. In the Caribbean, cassava and fruits like guava and pineapple were turned into local ferments that would later influence the colonial development of rum. Everywhere human hands met wild sugars, yeast followed. The universality of fermentation is not just cultural, it is biological. Yeast, specifically Saccharomyces cerevisiae, is one of the most adaptable organisms on Earth. It lives on fruit skins, in soil, on grain husks, even on our own skin. It feeds on simple sugars and converts them into carbon dioxide and ethanol. Humans did not invent fermentation. We simply began to cooperate with it. In a sense, we were domesticated by yeast as much as we domesticated it. Once we realized the predictable pleasure it could bring, we built entire social systems around it. And yet what makes this story extraordinary is not intoxication, it's connection. Every independent culture that found fermentation used it not just to escape reality, but to bind it together. Alcohol was never only a drink. It was a signal of belonging. To brew was to share time. To wait days for the mash to bubble and ripen required patience, planning, and trust. Fermentation taught us about process, the slow transformation that rewards attention. It's possible that through these rituals, early societies learned the rhythm that would later become agriculture, writing, and science. Observe, measure, wait, and transform. There's a biochemical poetry to it. The same reaction that makes bread rise also makes beer bubble. The same yeast that turns grape juice into wine turns grain mash into nourishment. These are not different discoveries. They are different accents in the same biological language. It is a language older than any myth, spoken by enzymes and air. What unites the world's earliest ferments is their modesty. Most were weak in alcohol, often only 1 or 2% by volume. They were not designed for drunkenness, but for safety, calories, and communion. In climates where water spoiled, fermentation purified. In communities separated by vast distances, it gave people a shared ritual, the daily act of turning grain or fruit into something sacred. It's as if humanity was wired to find the threshold between control and surrender, between food and transformation. Even the containers themselves carry traces of cultural identity. In China, dew was stored in elegant grey pottery with long necks. In Africa, thick clay vessels were wrapped in woven fibres to cool them through evaporation. In the Andes, large terracotta jars called 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿 were decorated with geometric designs, each symbol tied to lineage or landscape. Every vessel was both laboratory and artwork, every brew a collaboration between human craft and microbial will. Modern science has shown that yeast strains evolved alongside their human hosts. The yeasts used for rice fermentation in East Asia are genetically distinct from those in barley beer or African millet. Each lineage tells a story of domestication, not of animals or plants, but of microbes. Wherever humans settled, yeast evolved to match their environment, thriving in kitchens, breweries, and clay jars. It became the planet's first global symbiont, an organism whose success depends entirely on us and ours on it. What does that say about us? Perhaps that the impulse to ferment is part of being human, the instinct to transform what we have into something that can last, something that brings us together. We learned that the world could be persuaded to yield sweetness, that time itself could be tamed through patience. Even today, when we pour a drink, we echo that same lesson, that survival is not just about eating and drinking, but about waiting, transforming, and sharing. In every culture's earliest toasts, there's a common thread of gratitude, not for the drink itself, but for the invisible world that makes it possible, the yeast, the grain, the water, the warmth. Across continents and millennia, humanity found one universal ritual: to raise a cup, take a sip, and remember that life too is fermentation, an ongoing process of change bubbling quietly beneath the surface. Imagine this, a banquet on a marble terrace, high above the Aegean Sea. The evening air smells of olives and myrtle, bronze cups glint in the last light of day. a host raises his glass, filled not with grain beer but with a clear red liquid, wine. To the Greeks, and later to the Romans, this was not merely a drink. It was civilization itself, distilled. The Mediterranean world, which once knew the art of brewing, chose instead to forget it. Beer, thick, rustic and cloudy, was left to the north and to memory. In its place, wine became the symbol of refinement, intellect and divine order. The story of how that happened is not one of simple taste, but of climate, geography and class. The lands around the Mediterranean were made for vines. Warm, dry summers and gentle winters coaxed grapes to ripen in abundance, while barley struggled in thin mountain soils. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, where water and grain were plentiful, beer had thrived. But here, where hills caught the sun and limestone crumbled underfoot, grapes offered a sweeter bargain. To crush, ferment, and age them required less effort and yielded more elegance. Nature had handed the Greeks a different recipe for intoxication. By around 1500 years before the Common Era, Minoan and Mycenaean traders were already transporting amphorae of wine across the Aegean. When the classical Greeks inherited this trade, they built an entire philosophy around it. In their poetry, wine became the mark of civilization, the liquid of reason and song. Homer described heroes sharing craters of diluted wine after battle, their minds sharpened, not dulled. The god Dionysus embodied both fertility and frenzy, but even his myths insisted on balance. Too little wine, and you were joyless. Too much, and you were an animal. Beer, in contrast, was rarely mentioned except as a curiosity from foreign lands. Greek writers such as Herodotus and Xenophon noted that the peoples of the north, the Thracians, Scythians and Celts, drank a strange, foamy brew made from grain. They described it with a mix of fascination and disdain. The Greeks called it zythos in Egypt, sakara in the Near East, and barley wine in Europe, but it was always other. It was what non-Greeks drank, and in that label, barbarian, lay the beginning of a long prejudice. For the Greeks, fermentation was philosophy. Wine, when mixed properly with water, symbolized harmony between nature and intellect. Beer, unrefined and rustic, represented the opposite: chaos, appetite, and unmeasured indulgence. To drink wine was to join the symposium, to think, debate, and sing under reason's control. To drink beer in their eyes was to lose that control. The division was never about the chemistry of fermentation. It was about what kind of person you wished to be. When Rome inherited Greece's mantle, it also inherited its hierarchy of taste. The Romans admired the Greeks so deeply that they adopted wine as a cultural cornerstone. By the 1st century before the Common Era, vineyards covered the Italian peninsula. The wealthy cultivated rare varietals, aged them in clay amphora, and boasted of their vintages. To be Roman was to drink wine, and to export both the liquid and the idea wherever legions marched. Beer still existed, of course, brewed by the peoples Rome conquered. In Gaul, in Germania, and across Britain, Celtic and Germanic tribes fermented their grains in wooden barrels. Their ales were thick, smoky, and flavoured with herbs or honey. To Roman chroniclers, these drinks seemed crude. The historian Tacitus described the Germans as a people who pass a day and a night in drinking, and this vice, more than any other, contributes to their vices and quarrels. Julius Caesar, writing a century earlier, contrasted the disciplined Romans with the Belgae and Britons, who banned the import of wine to preserve their toughness. To Caesar, abstaining from wine was barbaric. To the northern tribes, it was virtue. The divide was both geographic and symbolic. Wine belonged to the sunlit south, to villas and libraries, to marble and logic. Beer belonged to the forests and fogs of the north, to wooden halls and firelit gatherings. Each beverage carried an identity, one measured and mathematical, the other wild and communal. But beneath that judgment lay a simple truth of resources. Rome's climate made wine cheap. Grain was for bread, not brewing. Beer remained a drink of scarcity, brewed by farmers, soldiers, and provincials where vines would not grow. Yet beer persisted quietly. Archaeological finds from Roman Britain show that even garrisons along the frontier brewed their own ales. When wine shipments ran low or spoiled, soldiers reverted to the grain they knew. In these borderlands, fermentation was survival, not fashion. Some Roman citizens even acquired a taste for it, though they rarely admitted as much in writing. Still, to the Roman mind, beer was a mark of otherness. The Latin term cervitia or cervitia, from which our word cerveza descends, was often used interchangeably with barley wine, implying a lesser cousin to the noble grape. The physician Dioscorides, writing in the 1st century, catalogued its medicinal uses but warned that it made the body heavy and the mind dull. Pliny the Elder noted that various northern tribes made intoxicants from grain, but he treated it as ethnographic trivia, a curiosity on the fringes of civilization. This cultural bias shaped not only taste but politics. Rome taxed wine, traded it, and used it to symbolize peace and prosperity. Statues of Bacchus, the Roman counterpart of Dionysus, adorned gardens and fountains. Wine was poured in rituals to Jupiter and in funerary offerings to the dead. The amphora became an emblem of empire, stamped with the mark of its maker and shipped from Gaul to the Levant. Beer left no such monuments. Its containers were wooden, its makers unrecorded. It was consumed quickly and locally, vanishing as completely as the foam on its surface. There's irony in that disappearance. The Mediterranean, birthplace of civilization, turned its back on one of humanity's oldest crafts. Beer did not vanish because it failed. It vanished because it didn't fit the story the ancients wanted to tell about themselves. Wine, clear and ordered, symbolized their vision of progress, of the mind rising above the earth. Beer, thick and earthy, reminded them that civilization still depended on the soil, but time has a way of humbling hierarchies. When Rome began to crumble, the vineyards that fed its taste for elegance withered too. Trade routes collapsed, amphorae stopped arriving, and cities shrank back into villages. In the cooler north, beer never left. It simply waited, brewing quietly in wooden halls and farmyards. Perhaps that is the lesson this chapter of history leaves us, that no culture ever truly owns fermentation. The Greeks intellectualized it. The Romans exported it. The Northerners kept it alive. In the end, yeast doesn't care about class or empire. It will find sugar wherever humans store it and start its slow, invisible work. What we call civilized taste is, in the long view of history, just another fashion of geography. The Greeks saw reason in wine, the Romans saw power, but behind both glimmered the same ancient chemistry, bubbles rising in clay, sugars turning to heat. Even as they dismissed beer as barbarian, they were participating in the same biological ritual that bound all humanity. So perhaps the question isn't why the Mediterranean forgot beer, but why it felt it had to. Maybe civilization's real measure isn't which drink we raise, but whether we remember what both of them meant, a moment of connection, of transformation, of humans and microbes collaborating in time. The amphora and the barrel were never rivals, only echoes of the same idea, that to be human is to ferment meaning from the simplest things. The empire is gone, the roads are cracked, the villas abandoned, the amphorae smashed in the dust. The vineyards that once fed the Roman taste for wine are overgrown with thorns. In their place, the forests creep back, wet, green, and cold. But in the smoke-lit halls of the north, something ancient continues to bubble quietly in wooden vats. The beer never died, it just changed hands. When Rome fell, it left behind more than ruins. It left a silence where systems had once been. Trade routes collapsed, cities shrank into villages, and the great wine amphorae stopped arriving. What remained of the Mediterranean ideal faded into memory, but in the damp, fertile regions of northern Europe and the British Isles, another tradition endured. There people still brewed ale the old way, thick, unfiltered and alive. It wasn't just a drink, it was survival. In these colder climates, vines would not thrive, but grain did. Barley, oats, rye and wheat grew resiliently in the northern soils, feeding both people and the small miracles of fermentation. Brewing was not an industry yet, nor a priestly art. It was a household task, passed from one generation to the next, from mother to daughter, neighbour to neighbour. The word brew itself comes from Old Germanic and Norse roots meaning to prepare, or to boil. It was as much part of daily life as baking or tending animals. In this world, every home was a microbrewery. Small batches of ale were made weekly, sometimes daily, from whatever grains were available. The ale was rarely strong, often between 0.5% and 2% alcohol, but it was dense with calories, vitamins and sugars. It was food as much as drink, a liquid bread that sustained workers, children and the elderly alike. In some regions, people drank up to 10 litres a day, not for celebration, but for nutrition. The water drawn from rivers and wells was often unsafe. Fermentation made it safer, transforming grain into something stable and slightly antiseptic. Ale was the North's answer to both thirst and hunger. The women who made it were known simply as alewives. Long before brewing became a masculine trade or a monastic science, it was women's work, one of the many invisible skills that kept medieval households alive. They malted their own grain, soaked and sprouted it, then dried it carefully over open fires. The malted grain was crushed and boiled with water in large pots or cauldrons, then left to cool and ferment with wild yeasts that floated naturally in the air. Some houses kept favoured vessels, ceramic jugs or wooden tubs, that had absorbed yeast over the years, making them prized possessions. Brewing was an act of care, not commerce. Each alewife brewed for her household first, and only if there was surplus would she share or sell it. The economy was neighbourly. A bucket of ale for a bundle of wool, a loaf of bread, or a day's labour. Communities recognised a good brewer the way we might recognise a good baker. Some women became local legends known for the sweetness or strength of their ale. To announce that a new batch was ready, an alewife would place a branch or broom outside her door. A simple, leafy signal fluttering in the wind that said, "The beer is good today." In England, these homes were called alehouses, and they became informal centres of community life long before taverns or inns existed. People gathered there to trade, gossip and plan. Alehouses were where deals were struck and songs were shared, where disputes began and sometimes ended. The alewife herself often presided as both host and mediator, pouring mugs and keeping order. Archaeological residues, microscopic traces of starches and yeasts, show that this home-based brewing was remarkably consistent across regions. In Scandinavia, households fermented barley or oats in clay or birchwood vessels. In the British Isles, the brew might include a mix of grains flavoured with herbs or honey. In the lowlands of modern Belgium and Germany, spelt and rye were common, and fermenting tubs were carved from hollowed logs. Despite local differences, the underlying science remained the same: water, grain, and time. Nature did the rest. The ale these communities drank was rarely what we would recognise today. It was cloudy, heavy, and often warm. It spoiled quickly, sometimes within days, and had to be brewed anew before it soured. To modern taste buds, it would have been more like a thin porridge than a crisp drink, but it carried energy and safety in every swallow. It was also deeply communal. Brewing was not about ownership, but about continuity, a rhythm of making, sharing, and remaking that bound households together. As centuries passed, this rhythm became part of the social fabric of the North. In Anglo-Saxon England, beer was so essential that kings codified it into law. Ale quality and price were regulated by local ale tasters, who sampled brews to ensure fairness and safety. The assize of bread and ale, issued in the 13th century but rooted in much earlier custom, formalised what villages had practised for generations: communal responsibility for the drink that sustained them. Yet long before those written laws, in the dark centuries after Rome's fall, the real regulation was the memory of taste, the collective knowledge of what good ale should be. In monastic records we catch the earliest written glimpses of this brewing world. When missionaries arrived from Rome to Christianise the North, they found not wild drunkenness, but a structured drinking culture. Ale was part of every meal, every offering, every negotiation. To refuse it was impolite, to abuse it was shameful. It wasn't just alcohol, it was social glue. There's a quiet poetry in how this tradition survived. Empires rose and fell, but fermentation required no empire. It asked only for grain, water, and patience. While cities burned, yeast kept working in silence, floating from one village to the next. It needed no Latin inscription, no godly blessing, only the warmth of a hearth and someone willing to wait a few days for bubbles to rise. By the early medieval period, brewing had become an art woven into the cycle of rural life. In spring, barley was sown, In autumn, it was malted and stored for the cold months when brewing was easiest. Festivals revolved around these rhythms: harvest ales, wedding ales, Yule ales, each marking the passage of time. Drinking together reaffirmed the bonds that held small, scattered communities together through winters that could otherwise feel endless. Ale also carried a moral dimension. In early Christian sermons, preachers often used brewing as metaphor, fermentation as transformation, purity, or patience. The yeast became a symbol of faith working quietly in the heart, just as it worked in the vat. It was not condemned, it was sanctified. In this way, the old pagan drink was slowly absorbed into a new moral order without losing its everyday role. And yet, while men came to dominate the public rituals of faith, women continued to dominate the craft of brewing. The alewife remained central to household survival well into the early Middle Ages. Some scholars suggest that the iconic image of a woman with a tall hat stirring a cauldron surrounded by cats may have originated from this role. Not from witchcraft, but from brewing. Cats kept rodents away from stored grain, cauldrons were brewing vats, and the hat simply made her visible in a crowded market. Over time, the image of the alewife blurred with superstition, but originally she was an alchemist of sustenance. As Europe slowly emerged from the shadow of Rome, its new societies were built not on marble but on clay and wood, and in those humbler materials beer continued its quiet work. The empires of the south had glorified refinement, the cultures of the north preserved resilience. One drink symbolized reason, the other endurance. But it was endurance that outlasted the fall. By around 900 years after the Common Era, ale was so embedded in northern life that it was part of wages, part of hospitality, and even part of healthcare. Monks, who would soon refine brewing further, prescribed it for strength. Mothers gave diluted versions to children. Travellers trusted it more than water. Every sip was a small victory against scarcity and disease, a reminder that even in hard times humanity had found a way to turn grain into warmth. If we imagine history as a great fermentation, this period was its quiet, bubbling stage. Invisible, domestic, but full of potential energy. While the South had forgotten beer in favour of elegance, the North kept it alive through simplicity. The alewife's hearth, the peasant's barrel, the neighbour's shared cup. These were the laboratories of civilization's recovery. In the centuries to come, new ingredients, new technologies, and new hierarchies would reshape what beer meant. But none of that would have been possible without these nameless brewers who, in the ruins of empire, refused to stop fermenting. They didn't preserve a recipe. They preserved a relationship between human beings and time itself. The next time we lift a glass, it's worth remembering that our entire brewing lineage rests not on emperors or philosophers, but on quiet hands stirring grain in the dim light of a wooden hall, listening for the first faint fizz of life. Imagine this: a cool morning mist over the Rhine Valley. Barley fields glisten with dew, and in the hedgerows, a vine climbs and twines its way toward the sun. Green, fragrant, almost unnoticeable. It isn't grain, nor grape, nor anything with obvious value. To most, it's a weed. Yet within its papery cones lies a molecule that will change the taste of Europe, alter economies, and even redraw trade routes. That vine is Humulus lupulus, hops, and its arrival in the medieval brewhouse marks one of the quietest revolutions in history. Before hops, beer was not bitter. Its flavour came from a mix of herbs and spices known collectively as groot, a blend that might include bog myrtle, yarrow, rosemary, juniper, or even heather. Each region had its own formula, and these recipes were closely guarded secrets. Groot was not just about taste, it was about control. Whoever owned the groot, whether a monastery, a local lord, or a bishop, owned the right to brew. In much of early medieval Europe, groot was taxed like salt or coin. To make beer was to owe tribute. The introduction of hops began as an act of experimentation, not rebellion. Brewers noticed that when they added small amounts of this climbing plant's flowers to their ale, it lasted longer before souring. At first, the effect must have seemed almost magical. The same grain, the same yeast, but a beer that stayed fresh for weeks instead of days. What they didn't know was that hops contain natural compounds, alpha acids and essential oils, that act as preservatives slowing the growth of spoilage bacteria and balancing sweetness with subtle bitterness. This small chemical advantage changed everything. For the first time in brewing history, beer could travel. A barrel of hopped ale might survive a river voyage or a cold winter without turning sour. Trade expanded. Local monopolies weakened. The old herbal lords of Greek began to lose their grip. We can trace this transition most clearly in the lands that would later become Germany and the Low Countries. Along the great rivers, the Rhine, the Elbe, the Meuse, hopped beer took root first among independent towns and abbeys that sought autonomy from feudal taxes. By the 10th century, documents mention hop gardens attached to monasteries, and by the 11th, cities like Bremen and Hamburg were exporting hopped beer northward to Scandinavia and England. Among the most remarkable witnesses to this transformation was a woman, Hildegard of Bingen, a Benedictine abbess and polymath writing in the 12th century. In her Physica, a vast compendium of natural history, she described hops as a plant that makes the soul of man sad, but also noted its power to prevent beer from spoiling. Her phrasing reveals both wonder and caution. The bitterness of hops carried symbolic weight, a new and almost alien taste in the medieval palate. To her, hops embodied restraint, an herb that cooled passion, tamed sweetness, and brought order to fermentation. Whether she approved of it entirely is unclear, but her record marks the first scientific description of what hops could do. The taste of Europe began to change in slow waves. For centuries, people had known beer as something soft and sweet, flavoured with local herbs. The new hopped brews tasted sharper, less comforting at first, but more stable and invigorating. They suited the evolving rhythms of towns, guilds, and trade. A peasant's ale might still be sweet and cloudy, brewed for a feast or harvest, but merchants and travellers preferred the longer-lasting hopped varieties. Beer was becoming not just a household craft, but an export commodity. In the port cities of the north, this change was revolutionary. Bremen and Hamburg became centres of production, shipping barrels of hopped beer along the Baltic and North Seas. These cities were part of the growing Hanseatic League, a confederation of trading towns that connected Scandinavia, the Low Countries, and the German heartland. Beer was light enough to ship, valuable enough to trade, and, thanks to hops, durable enough to survive the journey. It joined salt, wool, and herring as one of the League's defining exports. At the same time, brewing was beginning to organise itself as a profession. The scale of production required cooperation. Maltsters, brewers, coopers, and merchants all worked together in a chain of trust. Out of this came the first brewing guilds, local associations that set standards for ingredients, training, and price. Brewing was no longer a purely domestic art. It was becoming a craft with apprentices, masters, and public reputation. In towns like Leuven, Ghent, and Bruges, records of guild regulations appear by the late 12th century. These early guilds were part trade union, part quality control, and part moral order, ensuring that the new beers met communal expectations of purity and strength. Yet this shift was not universal or peaceful. In many regions, the old Groot authorities resisted fiercely. In some German principalities, church officials tried to ban hops outright, declaring them unnatural or unspiritual. After all, Groot production had been a lucrative monopoly, tied to religious authority. Every barrel of beer brewed with hops was a barrel untaxed, untithed, and unblessed. Disputes turned into legal battles, some lasting generations. But the chemistry was too persuasive, and the economy too tempting. By the end of the 12th century, hopped beer was winning. One of the most overlooked reasons for its victory was environmental. The herbs used in Groot grew best in wetlands and forest edges, habitats that were shrinking as medieval Europe's population expanded. Hops, however, could be cultivated systematically, trained up poles or trellises in small gardens near breweries. They were a renewable, predictable resource, adaptable to farming rather than foraging. The brewers who grew their own hops no longer depended on distant landlords or wild harvests. It's worth pausing to imagine what this meant for taste and identity. When you change what a civilization drinks, you change how it feels in its body. The gentle sweetness of old ales gave way to a leaner, more assertive flavour. The bitterness of hops reset the human palate, a sensory shift that mirrored a broader cultural one. The Middle Ages were becoming less localised, more connected, more disciplined. Beer itself reflected that order. It could now be counted, traded, stored, and trusted. Hopped beer also travelled farther than most people ever could. Barrels left the Rhine for the North Sea, crossed to England, and reached the Scandinavian fjords. Monasteries brewed it for pilgrims, merchants shipped it for profit, and sailors carried it as liquid food. Each keg was a small, portable piece of the new Europe, equal parts agriculture, chemistry, and faith. And yet, as transformative as hops were, the revolution they sparked was not just technical, it was emotional. The bitterness that Hildegard described as cooling the soul became the taste of endurance in a changing world. Hopped beer lasted longer not because it was stronger, but because it was balanced. Sweetness met by bitterness, pleasure by restraint. In that symmetry, people found a reflection of their own medieval ideals, piety, patience, and persistence. In time, this quiet transformation would lead to the vast brewing networks of later centuries, but here, in the 10th through 12th centuries, the story still feels intimate. Monks tending vines of hops in garden cloisters, merchants rolling barrels across damp docks, and farmers noticing for the first time that their ale no longer spoiled after a week. Each small discovery echoed across a continent. What began as a weed became a trade, and what began as a taste became a culture. The hop vine, once dismissed as wild, became a symbol of precision and permanence in a world that had long lived by improvisation. History rarely gives us revolution so subtle. No wars, no kings, no grand proclamations, just the rise of a plant, the patience of brewers, and the gradual taming of sweetness into something stable. That is how Europe's drink changed, not by conquest, but by chemistry. A stone monastery in the hills of Burgundy, the year around 900. The morning bells echo across the fog, and from a small outbuilding behind the cloister, the smell of warm grain drifts through the cold air. Inside, a handful of monks work in silence over steaming cauldrons. They are not cooking for themselves or even for their guests. They are brewing for God, or at least for God's travellers. The medieval monastery was not just a house of prayer. It was an early laboratory, a pharmacy, and perhaps most quietly, one of the first places where science began to ferment. For centuries after the fall of Rome, the monasteries of Europe became islands of continuity. They preserved the art of reading and writing, of measuring and recording. But they also preserved something more fragile, the knowledge of how to make food and drink last. In a world without refrigeration or industrial control, preservation was sacred. Beer, sweet, nourishing, and safe, was one of the few ways to make water dependable. Brewing became a monastic discipline not only because it provided sustenance, but because it demanded precision, repetition, and patience. All virtues that mirrored the spiritual life. The monks brewed for pilgrims, for travellers, and for the poor who arrived at their gates. A monastery without beer would have been as unthinkable as a monastery without bread. It was not a luxury but a necessity, part of a cycle of charity and labour that defined medieval Christianity. Yet this daily work, repeated generation after generation, made the monks inadvertent scientists. They observed patterns in temperature, air, and timing. They noticed that the foam on the surface of their wort, what we now call yeast, could change the taste, texture, and strength of a brew depending on how it was handled. They had no concept of microorganisms, but they understood that something invisible was alive inside their barrels. To them, fermentation was a kind of divine mystery, a transformation that turned ordinary grain into something that warmed the body and soothed the mind. In some monasteries it was described in spiritual terms. The grain died in the mash tun and was reborn as liquid bread. Brewing and theology shared metaphors of resurrection. But behind the poetry there was also method. Monks kept careful records of how long to soak the barley, when to dry it over the fire, and which vessel produced the best results. Each abbey developed its own local strain of tradition, what we would now recognise as a recipe. In regions like Flanders, Bavaria, and Normandy, these recipes became secret knowledge, protected as jealously as relics. The ingredients, proportions, and timing were rarely written down in full, but transmitted through apprenticeship. The monk brewer was both craftsman and gatekeeper, ensuring that every cask met the same standard. This secrecy had a practical purpose. Beer was valuable, and demand was growing. As villages formed around monasteries, travellers came not only to pray but to drink. The best brews earned reputations, and reputations attracted income. In some towns, the monastery's beer was the only safe drink available, turning it into an early form of economic power. Control of brewing also meant control of ingredients. The church and its associated institutions often managed the rights to collect and sell grut, the herbal mixture that flavoured pre-hopped beers. By monopolising these blends, monasteries ensured that every brewer who wanted to make beer had to buy from them. This was not mere greed, it was also a form of regulation. Bad beer could spread illness, spoiled beer could harm the reputation of the faith. So monasteries standardised brewing the way they standardised manuscripts, through discipline and hierarchy. In many abbeys, brewing was done at multiple strengths. There was prima melia, the strong beer reserved for guests and the abbot's table, secunda, a lighter version for the monks themselves, and tertia, often called small beer, brewed from the spent grains and given to labourers or the sick. Nothing was wasted. This hierarchy of strength reflected both economy and theology. Moderation, humility, and stewardship were built into the barrel. It's easy to forget how central monasteries were to everyday survival in the medieval world. They were safe havens on trade routes, hospitals during plagues, and granaries during famine. The brewing process, with its heating, boiling, and fermentation, made beer safer to drink than most water sources. In an age when rivers doubled as sewers, beer was a kind of controlled ecosystem, boiled, sealed, and naturally disinfected. For the average traveller or farmer, to drink monastic beer was to participate in one of the first large-scale public health systems in history. And yet, despite its religious context, brewing was deeply pragmatic. The monks noticed, for instance, that the same vessel used repeatedly for fermentation tended to produce more reliable results. Without knowing it, they were cultivating consistent yeast cultures on the wooden staves of their barrels. Some abbeys even kept starter foam from successful batches, stirring it into the next brewer's insurance, a proto-scientific practice that would not be formally explained until many centuries later. The environment of a monastery also favoured experimentation. Its daily rhythm of prayer and labour provided both patience and precision. Each day followed a schedule, each task was measured. Brewing fit perfectly into this monastic tempo. Soak overnight, stir at dawn, boil by midday, cool by vespers, seal before nightfall. The monks' devotion to routine allowed them to refine techniques gradually over generations. Their brewing logs, often disguised within account books or household records, show the slow accumulation of craft knowledge that would eventually feed into early chemistry. But beyond the practical, there was a philosophical undercurrent. In a world often defined by mystery and faith, fermentation offered a tangible miracle, one that could be observed, repeated, and shared. The monks didn't fully understand why it worked, but they knew that their careful hands could coax nature into cooperation. To watch the foam rise was to witness creation itself, bubbling quietly in a vat. By the 12th century, monastic brewing had spread across Europe. Benedictines, Cistercians, and Augustinians all brewed, each order emphasizing different virtues: simplicity, purity, charity. In France and Flanders, beer was light and sweet. In Bavaria, darker and heartier. The technology spread alongside faith, shaping local tastes. Every new abbey brought its own water, grain, and yeast ecology, creating distinct regional styles long before the concept of terroir entered human language. The monastery's control over beer extended far beyond the cloister walls. They influenced taxation, supply chains, and even land use. Some abbeys owned vast hop gardens, while others maintained herbal grounds for grut. They managed mills, malt houses, and distribution routes, blending religion, agriculture, and commerce into one seamless system. To drink their beer was to take part in an invisible network that stretched from ploughed field to altar. There's an odd irony here. While the monasteries taught humility and the renunciation of earthly pleasures, they also mastered one of humanity's oldest indulgences. Yet perhaps that contradiction is what made their contribution so lasting. In beer, they found both discipline and delight. They taught that even pleasure could be ordered, measured, and sanctified. And so, within stone walls meant for contemplation, Europe's brewing science matured in secret. Monks became the keepers of fermentation, not out of ambition, but out of necessity and devotion. Their breweries were sanctuaries of both faith and chemistry, long before the two would drift apart. Today, when we walk into a modern brewery and see stainless steel tanks and temperature controls, we're looking at the distant descendants of those monastic experiments. The monks may not have known the word yeast, but they knew its rhythm. They read it in the rising bubbles, in the warmth of the fermenting room, in the taste of the final pour. When we raise a glass of beer now, it's easy to forget how much of its lineage was shaped by silence, by the quiet work of people who believed that even transformation could be an act of prayer. And in some sense they were right, because to brew is to believe that something unseen can change the world if only given time and care. The year is 1516, and in the heart of Bavaria the smell of boiling wort drifts through the narrow streets of Ingolstadt. The sound of a scribe's quill scratches against parchment inside a modest ducal office, recording what will become one of the most famous sentences in brewing history. Outside, no one yet realises that a few short lines written in ink will shape the taste of Europe for centuries to come. The words are simple, almost bureaucratic. Beer shall be made only from barley, water and hops. But this small decree, known later as the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐌𝐏𝐒, the Bavarian purity law, was about more than ingredients. It was about control. For most of the medieval period, beer was a local language. Every village spoke it differently. Some flavoured it with rosemary, others with juniper, bog myrtle or yarrow. Brewers passed their blends like family secrets, each tied to their region's soil and season. But by the early 16th century that diversity was beginning to collide with something new, an economy of scale. Cities were growing, trade routes were thick with barrels. And in this increasingly connected world, uniformity meant power. The law of 1516 is often remembered as a gesture of purity, a noble attempt to protect the quality of beer. In truth, it was closer to a political weapon. Bavaria, one of the many territories within the fragmented Holy Roman Empire, was struggling with competition. Neighbouring regions were selling cheaper, sometimes adulterated brews. Some mixed in questionable ingredients, soot for colour, henbane or other narcotics for kick, and even chalk to imitate foam. To protect both consumers and local brewers, Duke Wilhelm IV issued the decree that all beer in Bavaria must be made only from 3 ingredients: barley, hops, and water. Yeast, though essential, was left unnamed, as no one yet understood its role. The first motive was economic. Wheat and rye were staple grains for bread, and during lean harvests their use in brewing could trigger famine. By restricting beer to barley, the law preserved food security and kept bakers supplied. It also gave Bavaria a monopoly advantage. The region's climate and soil favoured barley production, allowing it to thrive where wheat struggled. By defining pure beer as barley beer, the dukes protected their agricultural backbone while undercutting foreign competitors who brewed with wheat or spelt. The second motive was political. In a time when princes ruled patchwork territories, reputation was everything. Bavaria's leaders wanted their beer to symbolise not peasantry but prestige, something that could be exported as a mark of reliability and virtue. By legally branding their product as pure, they transformed a local beverage into a national identity. In a sense, this was one of the earliest examples of the government-backed quality control. The 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐌𝐏𝐒 became both marketing slogan and trade regulation, an early intersection of bureaucracy and taste. For brewers, the law was both a blessing and a chain. On one hand, it brought stability. Standards protected them from false accusations and gave their beer a consistent reputation across markets. On the other hand, it stifled experimentation. Generations of the local brewers who had relied on herbs for bitterness or flavour suddenly found their traditions outlawed. Some went underground, selling unclean beer in secret. Others adapted, learning to use hops, the rising star of the brewing world. The shift was irreversible. Hops had advantages beyond taste. Their natural antibacterial properties made beer last longer, allowing it to travel farther without spoiling. What began as a local necessity in northern Europe now became a continental export weapon. Barrels rolled out of Bavaria toward the Rhine and the North Sea, stamped with purity and stability. The law that had once protected a small duchy now helped define the brewing character of an entire culture. Still, purity was an idea with a double edge. Behind its simplicity lay centuries of lost flavours. The floral and spiced ales of the Groot tradition vanished from legal markets. With them went the herbal knowledge of women brewers who had once cultivated and sold those ingredients. Brewing became increasingly industrial, masculine and centralised. The church's influence waned, and secular guilds took over. Control of beer shifted from monasteries to merchant councils, from ritual to regulation. Yet this codification also paved the way for something remarkable: scientific consistency. Brewers began to observe their process with greater precision. They measured temperatures, standardised malt drying, and recorded boil times. Each parameter became an act of law rather than instinct. The 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐌𝐏𝐒 quietly introduced the concept that a recipe could be legislated, a radical idea in an age when taste had always been a matter of region or tradition. The cultural ripple spread quickly. Across the Holy Roman Empire, other territories adopted their own purity codes, each echoing Bavaria's logic. Beer was no longer just a local product, it was a statement of civic order. Towns like Munich, Augsburg, and Nuremberg competed for the title of most honest beer. To drink Bavarian beer was to drink trust itself, a rare commodity in an era of war, plague, and trade fraud. But the law also carried symbolism far beyond economics. To the people of the 16th century, purity was not only about ingredients but morality. A pure beer suggested a pure realm, ruled by a just hand. Corruption, in both taste and governance, could spread through the body like infection. Beer thus became a mirror of statecraft. Controlled, transparent and loyal to its origin. This was governance through brewing. The visual culture of beer began to reflect that authority. Guild symbols, barley stalks crossed with hop vines, appeared on city gates and tavern signs. Public beer tasting ceremonies, sometimes led by officials known as beer inspectors, became civic rituals. They would sip from freshly tapped barrels and declare before an audience whether the brew met the purity standard. These moments were part pageantry, part propaganda, reinforcing the idea that good beer meant good rule. For the everyday drinker, little changed immediately. The beer was still cloudy, nourishing and low in alcohol. It was food as much as drink, a meal in liquid form. But over time, the uniformity brought by the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒𝐌𝐏𝐒 began to create expectation. People grew accustomed to the clear bitter profile of hopped barley beer. Other styles, sweet, herbal or fruity, were pushed to the fringes, associated with rural backwardness. A shared taste was emerging, one that would eventually define European beer in the global imagination. And yet, the deeper story beneath the purity law is one of paradox. By trying to protect beer from adulteration, the Bavarian dukes inadvertently sparked the very innovation they feared. As hops replaced herbs and brewing scaled upward, new techniques emerged. Barley strains were selectively bred for consistency. Malting houses industrialized. Yeast, though unnamed, was cultivated more deliberately through careful reuse. Purity laws standardized the inputs, but they also inspired brewers to perfect the process within those constraints. In retrospect, the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐌𝐏𝐒 can be seen as the first bridge between medieval craft and modern science, a transition from mystical brewing to measurable brewing. It stripped beer of its ancient herbal diversity, but in doing so, it laid the groundwork for chemistry. It turned brewing into a controlled experiment that could be replicated, audited, and scaled. Today, the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒𝐌𝐏𝐒 still echoes in the language of marketing. Labels boast of purity, tradition, and 3 ingredients, even when the global beer industry has long since transcended its original meaning. The irony is that what began as a local tax law is now a symbol of authenticity worldwide. Yet the spirit of the decree, a balance of order, cleanliness, and pride, continues to resonate with drinkers who see in every glass of beer a trace of that ancient promise, that something simple, when done right, can outlast empires. So perhaps the real legacy of 1516 is not what it forbade, but what it made possible. A continental conversation about taste, integrity and identity that still bubbles quietly beneath every pore. When we raise a glass of beer today, we may not think of the Bavarian scribes who wrote the law, But we live within their world. Every sip carries a bit of their order, their ambition, and their belief that the smallest rule, if written with conviction, can reshape an entire culture's sense of flavour. Imagine this: a cold London morning sometime around the year 1670. The air hangs heavy with the smell of coal, wood smoke, and damp earth. Somewhere near the Thames, a brewer lifts the lid of a vast wooden tun, and a wave of steam curls upward, glowing faintly in the light of a newly kindled fire. The scent is not sweet and herbal as it once was. It's sharp, roasted and clean. Something new has entered the ancient marriage between grain and heat. Not a god, not a law, but a fuel. And with it, the quiet chemistry of beer is about to meet the mechanical age. For thousands of years, malt, the heart of beer, was dried over open wood fires. That meant smoke. Every beer, whether made in a medieval abbey or a farmer's cottage, carried that ghostly woody flavour, a taste so normal that no one could imagine beer without it. But wood was expensive, and forests across England were shrinking fast. The kingdom's hunger for iron, glass and shipbuilding timber left little room for brewers' fires. The answer came from deep underground: coal. Yet raw coal smoked worse than wood and tainted the malt with sulphur. The real revolution came when someone learned to burn it differently. By partially carbonising coal in the absence of air, they created coke, a cleaner, hotter, smokeless fuel. The earliest coke-fired kilns appeared in the 17th century. At first they were a curiosity, a wealthy brewer's toy, but soon their power became clear. Coke produced steady, controllable heat, allowing malt to be dried without the acrid bite of smoke. For the first time in history, malt could emerge pale, golden instead of brown. This single technical shift would ripple through centuries of brewing tradition. Pale malt changed the colour, flavour, and chemistry of beer itself. Lighter malt meant lighter beer, which in turn meant new styles, new tastes, and eventually new empires of industry. By the early 1800s, pale ale had begun its quiet ascent, but its roots stretched back here, to these first careful experiments with fire control. Brewers began noticing that pale malt fermented more predictably. It allowed them to see, for the first time, the delicate balance between grain sweetness and hop bitterness. This wasn't just taste, it was the start of measurement. Fire had always been the brewer's greatest variable. Too cool and the malt soured, too hot and it burned. But now, with coke-fired kilns, the flames could be tamed. This control demanded precision, and precision gave rise to new instruments. By the late 17th century, early thermometers began to appear in breweries. They were crude, fragile glass tubes filled with spirits and mercury, but they transformed brewing from art into process. Brewers no longer relied solely on instinct or inherited recipes. They could now repeat, record and refine. It's easy to overlook how radical this was. For millennia, beer had been a product of human senses: taste, smell, and sight. A brewer's success depended on how well they could read the bubbling of a vat, the feel of the mash, the scent of fermentation. Now, glass and metal instruments began to take that intuition and make it measurable. Around the same time, the hydrometer, an invention born from maritime science, found its way into the brewhouse. It could tell a brewer how much sugar was in a liquid, and therefore how strong the final beer would be. A new language of numbers entered the ancient world of yeast and grain. But this was not yet industrialisation in the modern sense. It was the threshold. England's cities were swelling. London, Bristol and Burton-on-Trent were becoming economic organisms powered by coal, trade and labour. Brewing followed suit. Taverns were not just meeting places, they were logistical nodes, supplying sustenance for a working population that often preferred beer to water. And for good reason. Water carried disease, but beer, boiled and fermented, was clean. As breweries grew, so did their ambition. The porter, a dark, nourishing beer beloved by London's working class, became the first drink of mass production. Its name came from the men who carried loads through the city streets: dock workers, market hands, and messengers. It was their beer, brewed strong and in bulk, stored in great wooden vats the size of small houses. By the mid-18th century, Some breweries produced tens of thousands of barrels a year, a scale unimaginable a century before. The use of coke and controlled heat made porter possible. Its malts could be roasted evenly, its character replicated batch after batch. Brewers began to blend beers of different ages to maintain consistent flavour, a technique that required both chemistry and logistics. Large companies like Whitbread and Thrales transformed the old craft into organised enterprise. They installed steam-driven pumps to move wort and experimented with early mechanical stirring. The brewhouse became a place of engineering as much as fermentation, but the heart of the change was still fire. Every improvement in fuel and temperature control opened new paths. The pale ale, delicate, golden and clear, owed its existence to the ability to malt barley gently. The same clarity of flavour that defined the Enlightenment's intellectual world began to define its drinks. Just as science sought transparency and reproducibility, so too did beer. The age of smoky mystery was fading, replaced by something sharper, cleaner, more measurable. Yet the shift also carried its own ironies. The pale beers prized for their brightness were harder to make in the murky cities that loved them. The purest malts demanded clean air and water, and so industrial breweries began to move outward, toward regions like Burton-on-Trent, where gypsum-rich water made hops shine and pale ale gleam. The geography of brewing shifted with geology, and entire towns became laboratories of taste. As the 18th century unfolded, brewers were no longer mere artisans but early industrialists. They managed workers, invested in machinery, and navigated markets that stretched across colonies. Beer had become both commodity and symbol, an emblem of Britain's mechanised modernity. The same coal that fuelled ironworks and shipyards also fired kilns and boiled wort. Brewing and empire rose together, each dependent on precision and energy. It is tempting to romanticise the earlier smoky ales as more authentic, but to the people of the time, this new clarity must have felt like progress itself. A beer that was golden, bright and predictable seemed to mirror the scientific age dawning all around them. The same fascination that led to the thermometer and the telescope also led to the hydrometer and the brewery logbook. Every bubble in the fermenting tune was now a data point, every batch an experiment. Still, there was a quiet poetry in these transformations. Steam, that most ordinary of vapours, became the breath of industry. Rising from kilns and kettles, it carried with it the memory of firelight gatherings stretching back to the Stone Age. The tools had changed, but the impulse was the same: to gather, to share warmth and intoxication, to turn nature's unpredictability into comfort. In every city street where porter barrels rolled, there was an echo of ancient feasts around glowing embers. The story of beer at this moment is the story of humanity's relationship with heat itself. From the control of open flame to the calibration of thermometers, each refinement represented another step in taming nature, and perhaps in distancing ourselves from it. The old brewers had brewed by touch and scent. The new ones brewed by measurement. And yet, when the day ended, both drank the same thing: a living liquid shaped by invisible life, unchanged in its essence since the first soaked grains of the Natufians. By the middle of the 18th century, brewing had become one of Britain's largest industries. The first brewing dynasties emerged, complete with ledgers, contracts, and trade secrets. Some historians call this the scientific awakening of beer, but it was more a marriage of patience and fire. Coke-fired kilns, once the symbol of resource scarcity, had birthed abundance instead. Pale malt became the standard, and with it came beers that could travel, to India, to the Caribbean, to the farthest reaches of empire. Fire had begun as a tool for survival. By now it had become a symbol of control, refinement and expansion. But beneath the steam and soot, the alchemy of fermentation remained as humbling as ever. Brewers still didn't know what yeast was. They only knew it worked, faithfully, mysteriously, transforming sugar into spirit. It would be another century before that invisible agent revealed itself under glass. For now the world was content to drink its miracles and call them progress. And so, in the haze above those first coke-fired kilns, something more than steam was rising. It was a new idea of mastery, that even the most ancient crafts could bend to human design without losing their soul. The smoke had cleared, and in its place shimmered the pale light of a coming industrial dawn. The product inside those barrels was less a drink than a demonstration, proof that fermentation could survive globalization. Beer, for the first time, had a shelf life that matched the ambitions of empire. It's fascinating to consider how much knowledge was still missing. Brewers had no understanding of microbes or fermentation chemistry. They worked through tradition, trial, and error. Yet through intuition alone, they learned how to manipulate time, temperature, and motion. They didn't know what yeast was, but they knew how to keep it alive across oceans. They didn't know oxidation as a chemical process, but they understood how to limit it by sealing casks with pitch and iron. In their own way, these brewers were as much navigators as the captains who carried their goods. By the late 18th century, beer was as integral to empire as gunpowder or textiles. Ships carried not just soldiers and cargo, but an entire culture of consumption. Taverns followed colonial frontiers from Calcutta's dusty alleys to Cape Town's harbours. Wherever European settlers went, beer followed. And yet, in most of these places, it never replaced indigenous fermented drinks entirely. Instead, it layered itself onto existing traditions, joining palm wine in Africa, millet beer in Asia, and chicha in the Andes. Beer became a global language of intoxication, spoken in different dialects of grain and yeast. This was also an era of subtle technological feedback. The demands of long-distance trade drove brewers to experiment with stronger barrels, better seals, and more consistent ingredients. Coopers, the barrel makers, became an essential class of artisans, and the design of the cask itself evolved to meet the needs of ocean transport. The modern beer keg, in a sense, was born at sea. The rolling motion of ships taught brewers how to think in terms of durability, not just taste. At the same time, the psychology of beer began to change. It was no longer purely communal or local. It became aspirational, a marker of civilization, health, and status. To drink British beer in a foreign land was to signal belonging to the empire's culture, its discipline, and its imagined superiority. In that way, each pint became a small act of empire. Back home, these exports fed national pride. The very act of sending beer halfway around the world without spoilage became a symbol of scientific and logistical triumph. Advertisements in newspapers boasted of India ales and imperial stouts, emphasizing endurance and strength. The language of conquest slipped naturally into the language of marketing. Yet for all its triumphalism, the system was fragile. Beer's journey across oceans depended on a narrow chain of conditions: stable ships, cool storage, access to clean water, and peace along trade routes. A single war, storm, or blockade could destroy a brewer's fortune. In that sense, the global beer trade mirrored the empire itself. Impressive, interconnected, and always at the mercy of chaos. By the dawn of the 19th century, brewing had become not just an art or an industry, but an infrastructure. The same ships that carried beer to India would later carry tea back to London. The same colonial networks that exported barrels would import sugar, coffee, and spice. Beer's history had fused with the history of commerce itself, and yet, beneath the maps and manifestos, the core of it remained astonishingly simple: people, grain, water, and time. The same yeast that had transformed soaked barley in a Natufian cave now travelled in the belly of empire ships, surviving storms and heat, unknowing of politics but essential to them. It is humbling to think that one of humanity's most enduring technologies was never fully understood by the people who built civilizations around it. When we look back at this era, what we really see is fermentation scaling up, biochemistry stretched across oceans. Beer had become a system, a trade language, and a measure of empire's reach. It was no longer enough to brew for a village or even a city. The ambition was planetary. And though those wooden barrels carried the flavour of home, they also carried something else: the beginning of globalization in liquid form. The next age would bring glass, microscopes, and refrigeration. But in these centuries of sail and steam, beer became the quiet pulse of empire. A humble drink turned into proof that even fermentation could be colonized, packaged, and shipped to the ends of the earth. A storm-thick horizon somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, around the year 1760. A ship creaks under the weight of hundreds of wooden barrels lashed to its deck, each sealed with iron hoops and pitch. Salt air seeps into everything, from the sailors' hands to the staves of the casks themselves. But below deck in the darkness, something is alive. Beer, thousands of gallons of it, is slowly changing. The rolling of the ship, the constant slosh of waves, the months of confinement in oak, it all becomes part of the recipe. Long before refrigeration, before modern chemistry, this was how beer conquered the world, by surviving the journey. At this point in history, beer had already evolved from a village staple into an industrial export. Britain's breweries, especially those in London and Burton-on-Trent, had learned to produce at scales unimaginable a century earlier. The porter, dark, strong and steady, was the city's drink of choice, and by the late 18th century it was being brewed by the thousands of barrels. Its resilience made it perfect for trade. Stout versions, fortified with extra malt and hops, became not just beverages but cargo fit for empire. Every cask carried more than alcohol. It carried the taste of home, the comfort of routine, and the prestige of power. Beer became one of the most practical luxuries of the colonial world. Soldiers, sailors, settlers, and governors demanded it, and supplying them became a logistical art. The journey from England to India could take 6 months or more, with extreme heat, motion, and bacterial decay constantly threatening to ruin the cargo. But brewers found that beer brewed with generous amounts of hops, those bitter antiseptic flowers, survived better. Hops not only flavoured beer, they protected it. This discovery laid the foundation for a style that would become a legend, the India Pale Ale. The IPA's origin story has been romanticised, but its logic was simple chemistry and geography. By the 1700s, British merchants needed a beer that could endure the equatorial heat on the voyage to Calcutta or Bombay. Their solution was to brew a pale ale with a higher alcohol content and a heavier dose of hops. The hops acted as a natural preservative, and the alcohol deterred spoilage. By the time the beer arrived months later, it had mellowed and clarified, developing the crisp bitterness that would define the style. The irony is that the ale most associated with India was brewed in England for Englishmen abroad. It was a drink of empire, not of exchange. The barrels that survived the voyage were often stronger and finer than when they left port. Some brewers, noticing this, began to intentionally age their beers during transport, turning the motion of the sea into a kind of mobile fermentation. The ocean became an ingredient. But the IPA was just one face of a much larger story. Beer was already circling the globe in many forms. Dark porters and stouts were exported across the Atlantic to the Caribbean and North America, while lighter ales reached Africa and the Pacific. Each barrel represented both ingenuity and inequality, a global network of trade routes, powered by colonization and the demand for European tastes abroad. Brewing, once a local and communal act, had become part of the machinery of empire. In London, enormous porter vats stood as monuments to industrial ambition. The Mew Brewery disaster of 1814, when a massive vat burst and flooded a neighbourhood with beer, killing 8 people, was not only a tragedy, it was a sign of scale. Breweries were producing liquid on a geological scale, enough to drown streets. The vast storage capacity was necessary because aging and blending were essential to beer stability. Casks of different ages were mixed to create a consistent product for export. Uniformity became a selling point, and in the process, beer began to lose some of its regional character. Meanwhile, colonial ports became staging grounds for beer's global spread. In Calcutta, British officers toasted empire in taverns lined with sweating barrels. In the Caribbean, enslaved labourers were sometimes paid in beer or rum, a grim reflection of how intoxicants were woven into systems of exploitation. In North America, colonial brewers, many of them recent immigrants from Europe, adapted traditional recipes to local grains like maize. These early breweries laid the groundwork for what would later become the American brewing tradition. Each shipment of beer carried with it the invisible economics of wood, metal, and distance. Oak for barrels came from European forests, iron for hoops from industrial forges, ships from dockyards manned by entire economies of labour. Imagine this. The year is 1842. The town of Plzeň in Bohemia is waking to a low autumn sun its tiled roofs glistening from the night's rain. Inside a stone cellar carved into the hillside, a young brewer named 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒 stands beside a wooden vat. The room smells faintly of barley, wood smoke, and cold limestone. In his hand is a ladle holding something new, a liquid so clear and gold that it catches the light like polished metal. He doesn't yet know that this shimmering beer will change the world. What he has just brewed is the first true Pilsner. For centuries, beer had been dark, cloudy, and heavy. Even in the industrial breweries of England and Germany, most beers were amber or brown, reflecting the kilns that had dried their malt. But something was shifting in Central Europe. Chemistry, trade, and local taste were colliding in one unlikely place. A provincial town where the citizens, frustrated by years of poor-quality beer, decided to start over. They pooled resources, built a modern brewery, and hired a Bavarian with a reputation for precision. That man was Josef Groll. Groll arrived from Wilshofen, bringing with him a mastery of bottom fermentation, a process perfected in the cool caves of southern Germany. But Bohemia offered him something Bavaria did not: pale, soft barley and mineral-rich water. Combined, they would give his beer a clarity and smoothness unlike anything Europe had seen. The key was the malt. Using the New English technique of indirect kiln drying, Groll produced a malt so pale that, when brewed, it reflected the colour of the dawn itself. This was science meeting serendipity. The yeast he used, a bottom fermenting strain brought from Bavaria, worked best in cold conditions, settling at the base of the fermenting vessel and creating a beer that was cleaner and more stable. The local Saaz hops, delicate, floral and aromatic, balanced the malt's sweetness with a subtle bitterness. When combined with the unusually soft water of Pilsen, low in calcium and sulfates, the result was transformative. The beer was golden, crisp and brilliantly clear. In an age of dark ales and murky porters, it looked almost supernatural. But the world might never have fallen in love with Pilsner if not for another invention: glass. Until the mid-19th century, most Europeans drank beer from opaque mugs made of pewter, ceramic, or wood. You could taste beer, but you could not truly see it. As glass production became cheaper and more widespread, brewers gained a new ally: transparency. The sight of a golden beer, shimmering with carbonation under sunlight, was as powerful as its flavour. It looked like liquid wealth, something pure and alive. In taverns across Bohemia and Austria, patrons were entranced. They lifted clear glasses toward the windows, watching bubbles rise like sparks. The colour alone felt revolutionary, a sensory language everyone understood. Dark beer had been the drink of labourers. Golden beer looked like prosperity. Within a few decades, Pilsner would become the visual standard for what beer looked like. Its hue would come to define an entire industry, from advertising to packaging. The chemistry of Pilsner's success lay in its ingredients, but also in its precision. The cold caves of Pilsen provided natural refrigeration long before machines existed. Brewers could store barrels for months, allowing yeast and proteins to settle out naturally. The result was a level of brightness and stability that seemed miraculous to drinkers used to sediment and haze. It wasn't just refreshing, it was reliable. By the mid-19th century, the world was entering an age obsessed with clarity, in glass, in science, and in thought. Microscopes, telescopes, and crystal optics symbolized progress. Pilsner fit perfectly into that worldview. Here was a drink that captured the same ideals: transparency, purity, and control. It was beer made visible, a metaphor for modernity you could hold in your hand. The timing could not have been more perfect. Railways were spreading across Europe, carrying barrels of Pilsner farther than any Bohemian brewer had dreamed. In Vienna, the Dreher family adapted Groll's method to create their own amber variant, the Vienna Lager, while in Munich, the Sedlmayrs at Spaten refined bottom fermentation for mass production. Together, these brewers forged a new family of beers defined by temperature, patience, and colour. But Pilsner remained the original, the gold standard. When you imagine that first glass of Pilsner Urquell, the original source, it's easy to forget how alien it must have seemed. To 19th century palates accustomed to the heaviness of ale, this was like tasting air. The beer was dry but not harsh, floral but not sweet, and sparklingly alive. Its bubbles, trapped in the viscous liquid, reflected not just craftsmanship but time itself. Months of careful aging in the cool dark. Drinkers described it as refreshing, a new word for a new kind of intoxication. Even the town of Pilsner transformed around it. Breweries expanded, glassmakers and coopers flourished. The beer's reputation spread faster than the science behind it. Within decades, Pilsner stopped being a place name and became a category. Every city wanted its own version. Dortmunder, Carlsberg, Heineken, Budweiser. The name turned from a geographic marker into a global ideal. Yet what made Pilsner truly revolutionary was not just its recipe, but its accessibility. It was affordable, consistent, and universally appealing. It didn't demand acquired taste or cultural background. It was beer simplified and perfected, the closest thing humanity had come to liquid neutrality. Its golden colour spoke to all classes. Its cold crispness transcended climates. For the first time, a single style of beer could move seamlessly between palaces and public houses. The spread of Pilsner also mirrored the democratization of science. Just as chemistry and physics were becoming tools of everyday progress, brewing was shedding its mystery. Brewers began keeping records of temperature and timing, treating fermentation as an experiment rather than a ritual. The results were not only reproducible but scalable. With each batch, the world moved a little closer to industrial brewing as we know it. There's something profoundly human about our fascination with gold. From ancient ornaments to currency to modern screens, we've always chased that shimmer, the illusion of perfection. Pilsner gave the world that shimmer in a glass. Its appeal was not just sensory but symbolic. Light captured, refined, and made drinkable. To drink Pilsner was to participate, however briefly, in the dream of progress. Still, behind its beauty lay fragility. The beer's very clarity made it vulnerable to contamination, light, and time. Without refrigeration or airtight bottling, Pilsner remained a delicate product, dependent on local cellars and careful handling. For now, its reach was limited by geography and season. But that would not last. Science, once again, was closing in. In the decades that followed, innovations in microbiology and cooling would turn the Pilsner from a regional marvel into a global phenomenon. But in this moment, in that Bohemian brewhouse in 1842, it was simply an act of craft. A man from Bavaria, working in a foreign town, combining techniques and ingredients from 3 nations, created a beer that reflected the spirit of an entire century. It is difficult to overstate how much of modern beer's identity can be traced to that single vat in Pilsen. Every light lager, every commercial pint of gold carries its genetic memory. The technology may have changed, but the aesthetic remains. Purity, brightness, and the illusion of simplicity. And perhaps that is why the story still matters. The first Pilsner wasn't just a technical achievement, it was a shift in how we see what we drink. It turned beer from nourishment into spectacle, from something shared to something admired. When Grawl tilted his ladle that morning and saw the sunlight catch in the liquid, he wasn't just looking at beer, he was looking at the modern world glowing back at him. A single drop of beer under a microscope. Within it, a hidden universe is moving. Tiny translucent shapes pulsing, dividing and transforming sugar into something the human tongue recognizes as pleasure. For thousands of years, brewers had worked by feel and faith, trusting invisible forces that turned porridge into drink. But now, in the middle of the 19th century, humanity was beginning to see the invisible. The age of observation had arrived, and beer, one of our oldest biochemical companions, was about to become a window into life itself. It began with a French chemist who wanted to know why wine sometimes spoiled. Louis Pasteur, working in a modest laboratory in Lille, noticed something strange in his flasks of fermenting grape juice. The liquid clouded with life. Under the microscope he saw tiny round cells multiplying as fermentation proceeded. When the wine went sour, the shapes changed. Different organisms appeared, consuming what the first ones had produced. Pasteur realized what no brewer or vintner had ever proven. Fermentation wasn't a chemical reaction of dead matter. It was the work of living beings. This revelation shattered a long-standing assumption. Since antiquity, fermentation had been seen as a kind of spontaneous transformation, a mysterious self-ignition of matter. Pasteur's experiments showed it was neither spontaneous nor magical. It was biological. He called these agents ferments, what we now call yeast, and for the first time humans understood that every sip of beer was a collaboration between species. The insight was revolutionary not only for brewing, but for science itself. It helped destroy the idea of spontaneous generation, the belief that life could arise from lifelessness. By proving that only existing microbes could create new life, Pasteur opened the door to germ theory and modern microbiology. Beer, quietly bubbling in its vat, had become a model organism for the birth of biology. Brewers, ever pragmatic, saw the immediate implications. If microscopic organisms could spoil a batch, they could also perfect one, if only you could control them. Across Europe, scientists and brewers began to experiment. In Munich, Gabriel Sedlmayr and Anton Dreher applied Pasteur's lessons to their lagers, adjusting temperatures and cleanliness with newfound precision. But it was further north, in Copenhagen, that one brewer would take the next great step, isolating pure yeast. Jacob Christian Jacobsen, founder of the Carlsberg Brewery, believed that science and beer belonged together. He built his own research laboratory, an extraordinary act for a businessman of his time, and filled it with microscopes, glassware, and young chemists. There, in the 1870s, his team began identifying the many different yeasts living in each batch of beer. The goal was purity, to separate the strain that produced the desired flavour from the ones that caused contamination. It was a young scientist named Emil Christian Hansen who finally succeeded. By growing yeast cells on solid culture media, he managed to isolate a single, genetically uniform strain, the ancestor of nearly all modern lager yeasts. Carlsberg called it Saccharomyces carlsbergensis, and in an act that still feels visionary, Jacobsen made it freely available to other brewers. He understood that true progress required open science, not secrecy. The yeast spread across Europe, quietly standardizing flavour and stability. The result was a beer that tasted the same in any season, in any city. Meanwhile, another revolution was taking place, one of temperature rather than life. In Munich, a German engineer named Carl von Linde was developing a new technology that could generate artificial cold. His ammonia-based refrigeration system, perfected in the 1870s, allowed brewers to maintain consistent low temperatures year-round. No longer dependent on caves or winter ice, breweries could now produce lager in every month, in every climate. Fermentation, once the patient rhythm of the seasons, had been industrialized. The partnership between Pasteur's biology, Hansen's yeast, and Linde's refrigeration defined the modern era of brewing. Together, they turned what had once been an unpredictable craft into a precise science. The transformation was so complete that within a few decades the concept of bad beer would almost disappear. Spoilage became rare. Stability became expected. The flavour of beer became measurable, repeatable, and, for the first time, global. And yet something was lost in that transition. Before the microscope, fermentation had been alive not only in the vat but in imagination, a kind of quiet alchemy that made brewers humble. Now it was measurable, and in becoming measurable it became controllable. Beer no longer carried mystery, it carried data. For better or worse, this marked the end of an era when the unknown could be part of daily life. Still, the sight of those first yeast cells under glass must have been profound. To see life working invisibly, tirelessly, without intention, converting the energy of plants into the language of taste, was to glimpse the deep continuity of biology. Fermentation wasn't invention, it was participation. Humans had simply learned to harness a process the natural world had been performing for millions of years, from rotting fruit to forest soil. Pasteur himself saw that continuity. He often remarked that fermentation and decay were cousins, two expressions of the same microscopic will to live. Where one produced nourishment, the other produced rot. The difference lay only in direction, in balance. Beer became his metaphor for control, how to guide invisible life toward harmony rather than chaos. In the quiet of his laboratory, amid flasks of bubbling broth, he wasn't just studying yeast, he was studying civilization. The ripples extended far beyond brewing. Pasteur's techniques led directly to vaccines, to sterilization, to public health. Linde's refrigeration revolutionized food storage, medicine, and global trade. The scientific understanding of yeast influenced everything from baking to biochemistry. Every loaf of bread and bottle of wine still carries the legacy of that first revelation, that the smallest life forms shape the largest human stories. By the end of the 19th century, breweries looked more like laboratories than workshops. Shiny copper kettles stood beside thermometers, pressure gauges and glass spectrometers. Men in white coats replaced those in leather aprons. Brewing was no longer a matter of intuition, but instrumentation. The air smelled not just of malt and hops, but of alcohol lamps and sterilized glass. The line between brewer and scientist blurred until it disappeared completely. Yet, in that sterile precision, one can still find poetry. To think that something as humble as beer, the drink of farmers and labourers, born in caves and clay pots, had become one of humanity's first great biochemical triumphs is strangely comforting. It reminds us that progress doesn't always begin with ambition. Sometimes it begins with curiosity, with the quiet act of watching bubbles rise in a jar and asking why. If the 18th century had given us the colour of beer, the 19th gave us its meaning. We learned what makes it live, what makes it die, and what invisible world lies within it. In understanding yeast, we began to understand ourselves, organisms that consume, transform and adapt. The science of taste, it turns out, is the science of being alive. And perhaps that's the most enduring revelation of all, that the beauty of fermentation lies not only in what it produces but in what it reveals. Every sip of beer, every rising loaf, is a reminder that we are surrounded by life we cannot see, a silent ecosystem that sustains us, flavours us, and, in a way, defines us. The microscope didn't just show us yeast, it showed us the living planet beneath our senses. A city skyline shimmering with gaslight, railways hissing with steam, and at the edge of it all a row of vast copper kettles glowing like the organs of some new industrial creature. It is the late 19th century, and beer has entered the age of machines. No longer brewed by instinct or faith, it is being replicated, bottled and shipped on a scale the world has never seen. The quiet art of fermentation has become a global enterprise, its heartbeat now mechanical, its rhythm the pulse of an assembly line. The revolution had been building for decades. With the spread of Pasteur's methods, refrigeration, and pure yeast cultures, beer was finally stable, predictable enough to survive transport across continents. Industrialization simply did the rest. Railroads carried raw materials to city breweries and finished barrels to ports. Steam engines powered grain mills, pumps and bottling machines. Where once a single brew took weeks of muscle and firewood, now hundreds of thousands of litres could be produced under one roof. In Amsterdam, Gerard Adriaan Heineken built one of Europe's first truly modern breweries. It was an architectural marvel, a cathedral of brick and iron fitted with cooling pipes, pressure valves, and laboratory glass. Heineken's engineers used bottom-fermenting yeast, imported from Carlsberg's pure culture, and a new cooling system inspired by Linde's technology. The result was consistency on a level no small brewer could match. Every bottle, every glass tasted the same, and that sameness became its strength. In Copenhagen, Carlsberg itself was expanding from research laboratory to industrial powerhouse. Jacobsen's original commitment to science had evolved into something larger, a model of corporate modernity. His brewery was built like a university campus, complete with a library, employee housing, and ornate gates engraved with the words Semper Ardens, always burning. That phrase would become a metaphor for industrial ambition, endless production, endless innovation, endless thirst. Across the sea, another empire was rising. In Dublin, Arthur Guinness's descendants transformed their family stout into a symbol of Ireland itself. The Guinness brewery at St James's Gate grew into a self-contained city, complete with its own railway system, cooperage and laboratory. By the 1880s, it was the largest brewery in the world. Its dark porter, rich, creamy and bitter, travelled in oak barrels from London docks to colonial ports, a taste of home for soldiers and merchants alike. Beer had become not just a beverage, but a cultural export. In the United States, the same story was unfolding under different skies. German immigrants, carrying the brewing traditions of Munich and Bohemia, set up shop in Milwaukee, St. Louis, and Cincinnati. Among them was Adolphus Busch, who co-founded Anheuser-Busch. His innovation wasn't just in brewing, but in logistics. He built an empire on the back of two technologies, pasteurization and refrigeration. By applying pasteur's heat treatment methods, Busch could extend beer's shelf life long enough to send it by rail across the country. With refrigerated train cars, among the first in America, Budweiser reached cities that had never seen a European-style lager before. These industrial breweries were more than factories. They were symbols of a new kind of modern faith, a belief in uniformity, precision, and control. The beer they produced no longer varied from season to season or from barrel to barrel. It was engineered to be identical, dependable, safe. For workers leaving the factory floor or travellers far from home, that sameness became a comfort. A bottle of Heineken in Amsterdam, a Carlsberg in Copenhagen, or a Budweiser in St. Louis, they all offered the same quiet promise. Familiarity in a changing world. Packaging changed everything too. Bottling plants, powered by steam and later electricity, replaced wooden casks with glass, transparent, portable and brandable. Labels became emblems of identity, printed with crests, fonts and colours designed to catch the eye of a modern consumer. For the first time, beer had a face. Heineken's green star, Guinness's harp, Budweiser's red script. These were the visual ancestors of the global logos that would later define the 20th century. Beer had entered the language of marketing, its story told not just by taste but by image. At the same time, railways and refrigeration created a new kind of geography. Beer was no longer local, it was logistical. A train could deliver fresh lager from Munich to Hamburg in days. Ships equipped with cold storage could carry it to Africa, India, or the Americas. The world's climate zones no longer mattered. A style born in cold cellars could now thrive in the tropics. For the first time in history, beer was global. But with that globalization came new challenges. The sheer scale of production demanded precision not just in brewing, but in chemistry, engineering and labour. Breweries employed scientists, machinists, and accountants alongside traditional brewers. Recipes became formulas, vats became vessels of calculation. Where monks once prayed for a good fermentation, technicians now checked pH levels and temperature gradients. The language of spirit had become the language of statistics. And yet in the hum of those machines something profoundly human persisted. Industrial beer still carried the memory of clay jars and stone circles, of feasts and fermentation fires. Each bottle was the descendant of that first accidental brew at 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒�ㄟ cave 13,000 years earlier. The difference was that now the process was deliberate, organised, and infinite. What had once been a ritual of scarcity had become an engine of abundance. By the turn of the 20th century, beer was feeding cities in more ways than one. It provided calories, wages, and a sense of cultural belonging. Brewery towns grew around their vats. Workers identified with their brands, not as consumers but as creators. To work for Guinness, Carlsberg or Heineken was to belong to a new industrial tribe, one bound not by lineage but by process. Advertising began to shape that identity further. Early posters showed smiling labourers, elegant women, and exotic landscapes. The first signs of beer's transformation from necessity to narrative. A drink once brewed for survival had become a symbol of relaxation, friendship, and pride. The story had shifted from how it's made to how it feels. But behind every slogan and every label, the infrastructure of industrial brewing kept expanding. Cold storage warehouses, bottling plants, and railway lines formed a silent network connecting continents. Beer flowed along the same routes as coal, steel, and grain, a liquid part of the industrial bloodstream. It was no longer tied to harvests or climate. It was tied to capitalism itself. Still, even in this era of mechanization, innovation had an aesthetic side. The massive copper kettles gleamed under gaslight like sculptures. Factory tours became points of civic pride. Cities boasted of their breweries as symbols of progress. For many, the sight of a bottling line, glass clinking in rhythm under the hiss of steam, was as mesmerizing as the drink itself. When we look back now, it's easy to see this period as the moment beer lost its soul, when craft gave way to mass production. But it was also the moment when beer became truly democratic. For the first time, anyone could afford a clean, stable drink. Disease rates dropped as industrial beer replaced unsafe water. Pasteurization, refrigeration, and hygiene did more than protect a product. They protected people. The science of brewing became part of the science of public health. And perhaps that's the paradox of industrialization. The tension between scale and soul, between perfection and variety. Every bottle was identical, but every sip carried the same ancient memory. Grain, water, and time meeting in a quiet chemical dance. Even as the machines roared and the trains rolled, fermentation remained what it had always been, the most patient act in human history. By 1900, the world was drinking the same few brands of beer, each tied to a story of innovation and ambition. Heineken represented science, Guinness represented endurance, Budweiser represented reach. Together they formed an empire of taste, a preview of the globalized century to come. The world had become smaller, colder, faster, and beer, faithful as ever, adapted to it. What began in ancient caves and stone vats now flowed from steel tanks and mechanized bottling lines. Humanity had mechanized one of its oldest instincts, to share, to celebrate, to transform. And though the craft had changed, the impulse behind it had not. The machines simply made the ritual infinite. Imagine this. The taps are silent, the barrels dry, and the air that once smelled of barley and steam now carries only dust. For the first time in thousands of years, the act of brewing, one of humanity's oldest continuous habits, becomes a crime. Between the early 20th century and the turbulent decades that followed, entire nations tried to outlaw not just a drink, but a part of their own identity. The story of beer during the age of prohibition and war is not one of disappearance, but of transformation, a test of endurance for an ancient ritual that refused to vanish. The first blow came not from moralists, but from war. When the First World War broke out in 1914, barley fields became battlefields, and copper vats were melted down for ammunition. Across Europe, breweries were commandeered or shuttered, their workers drafted into the trenches. In Britain, strict rationing laws and moral campaigns urged citizens to abstain, arguing that sobriety would strengthen the war effort. In Germany, barley was diverted to bread, not beer. Even water became a matter of strategy, diverted to factories, soldiers, or hospitals. The pint glass, for the first time in centuries, felt heavy with guilt. The war did something else too. It showed how quickly governments could control what people consumed. New forms of bureaucracy, ration cards, permits, inspections, became tools of moral engineering. In the United States, where temperance movements had been gathering momentum for decades, the wartime rhetoric of sacrifice provided the perfect moral cover for a long-planned crusade. When the 18th Amendment passed in 1919, banning the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcohol, it wasn't just beer that vanished. It was a way of life. But beer, as it turns out, is a stubborn organism. It has always adapted to new climates, new crops, new gods. In the face of prohibition, it simply changed shape. Breweries that had once produced millions of barrels a year rebranded themselves as near-beer factories, making beverages with less than 0.5% alcohol, legal in name, if not in spirit. Others diversified entirely. Anheuser-Busch made ice cream and yeast extract. Coors produced malted milk and porcelain products. Pabst pivoted to cheese. The infrastructure of beer, from refrigeration lines to bottling machines, didn't disappear. It just went dormant, like yeast waiting for better conditions. The black market filled the vacuum. In the basements of American cities, bootleggers brewed in bathtubs, smuggled kegs through tunnels, and bribed police with quiet efficiency. In Chicago, Al Capone's empire of illegal breweries and speakeasies turned beer into blood money. What had once been a communal act of refreshment became a symbol of defiance, and the tavern, long a place of friendship, became a frontier of crime. The unintended consequence of moral purity was industrial corruption. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, European breweries were facing their own tests. The post-war years brought inflation, political upheaval, and another looming conflict. In Germany, the economic collapse of the 1920s forced consolidation. Smaller breweries closed, while a few large ones survived by modernising and cutting costs. Beer became lighter, cheaper, more standardised. In Britain, austerity and taxation weakened the strong ales of earlier centuries. Mild beer became the drink of the working class, not out of preference, but out of necessity. And then came another war. When the Second World War erupted in 1939, the fragile revival of European brewing was once again dismantled. Barley was rationed, glass was scarce, and men were conscripted. In Nazi Germany, breweries were nationalised and directed to supply the military. Soldiers received liquid bread in their rations, echoing a tradition that stretched all the way back to the pyramids. In Britain, the government imposed strict limits on brewing strength, reducing both alcohol content and variety. A generation grew up knowing only weak, watery ale, the taste of survival. In the United States, though, something different was happening. Even before the war, the failure of prohibition had become undeniable. Crime had risen, tax revenues had vanished, and the public's patience had evaporated. By 1933, the 21st Amendment repealed the ban, and the taps flowed again. But the world they reopened into was not the same. Breweries that had survived prohibition emerged leaner, more mechanised, and far more cautious. They had learned how to adapt to regulation and scarcity. Now they would apply those lessons to efficiency and mass marketing. For drinkers, the return of legal beer was euphoric but bittersweet. Gone were many of the robust regional brews that had once defined American towns. In their place came light, crisp lagers designed to please the widest possible palate. This was partly due to economics. Barley supplies were limited, so brewers turned to rice and corn as cheap adjuncts. But it was also psychological. After 2 decades of bans and moral judgment, the public wanted something uncontroversial. The result was a new kind of beer. Pale, refreshing, easy to drink, and easy to forget. The war years that followed reinforced this trend. American soldiers stationed overseas were given light lagers as part of their rations, associating the taste with home, safety, and victory. When they returned, so did their preferences. The American lager became not just a drink, but an identity, one built on efficiency, consistency, and restraint. Beer had gone from sacred ritual to industrial commodity, and now to national symbol. The irony was that prohibition had accomplished the opposite of what its architects intended. Instead of eliminating alcohol, it industrialized it. The small local brewers who could have embodied a more moderate drinking culture were wiped out, leaving only the large companies with the resources to survive. In trying to control human appetite, society had streamlined it. The beer industry that emerged after 1933 was leaner, more centralized, and more capable of shaping culture than ever before. And beneath the surface of these economic shifts lay something more emotional, a deeper lesson about prohibition itself. When societies try to outlaw pleasure, they rarely extinguish it, they just drive it underground. The human impulse to ferment, to alter consciousness, to gather and share, it is not an indulgence. It is part of our species architecture. The same chemistry that turns sugar into alcohol also turns solitude into company. We ferment not just grains, but experiences. Across the world, this resilience echoed in quieter ways. In Japan, sack production persisted through state controls. In Africa, millet and sorghum beers continued in local villages despite colonial restrictions. In the Andes, women still brewed chicha in clay jars, maintaining traditions older than cities. Everywhere, fermentation found a way to continue, quietly, patiently, beneath the surface of empire and ideology. By the end of the Second World War, global brewing was a patchwork of ruins and survivors. Some factories stood as empty shells, their copper vats melted down for the war effort. Others, like Guinness and Heineken, had endured by adapting production to wartime needs, making malt syrup, soft drinks, or nutritional tonics. When peace finally came, they were ready to rebuild faster than any small competitor could. But that rebuilding would come with a price. The diversity of beer styles that had once coloured Europe's drinking culture was now narrowed to a pale, efficient spectrum. Light lagers dominated, not because they were the most flavourful, but because they were the most replicable. The world's oldest social technology had survived prohibition and 2 global wars. but at the cost of its complexity. And yet, beneath all the standardization, the human memory of flavour persisted. Soldiers remembered the taste of stronger beers from before the war. Immigrants recalled the farmhouse ales of their homeland. Somewhere, deep in the yeast of history, the idea of difference was still alive. The taps had gone dry, yes, but the thirst for variety was waiting quietly to return. By the 1930s, a glass of beer no longer carried the rustic identity it once had. It was cleaner, colder, more precise, but perhaps also lonelier. In the flickering light of neon tavern signs, the last echoes of a communal drink were being replaced by a commercial one. Humanity had learned to regulate everything — crops, yeast, morality — except its own longing for connection. Maybe that's what Prohibition really revealed. Not the dangers of alcohol, but the futility of trying to legislate away an instinct that predates civilization itself. We are, after all, the species that learned to turn decay into nourishment, to make sweetness from rot, and to celebrate that transformation together. Banning beer was never just about alcohol. It was about misunderstanding what it means to be human. A factory floor humming in endless rhythm, rows of silver cans gliding under fluorescent lights, their soft metallic clicks echoing like clockwork. Somewhere far away, a farmer watches his barley harvested by machines, its path from soil to shelf now shorter, colder and quieter than ever before. The ancient art of fermentation has become an industry of precision. By the middle of the 20th century, beer, once local, ritualistic, even sacred, had become one of humanity's first truly global products. But when something becomes universal, something else tends to vanish. After the Second World War, the world was rebuilding, cities, economies and appetites. Soldiers returning from Europe and the Pacific carried with them a memory of light, refreshing lagers, cold, golden, dependable. In America, this nostalgia became a business model. Companies like Anheuser-Busch, Miller and Schlitz expanded beyond state borders, building continental empires of steel and foam. Refrigeration, perfected during the war, made cold beer a promise as much as a product. With refrigerated rail cars, long-distance trucking and suburban supermarkets, beer was no longer tied to season, region or craft. It could exist everywhere, identical in taste and texture. In Europe, a similar transformation unfolded. Heineken, once a family brewery in Amsterdam, became the first truly international beer brand, shipping green bottles from Africa to the Caribbean. Carlsberg adopted modern marketing, its clean white label and green typography, standing as an emblem of science, quality, and control. In Ireland, Guinness evolved from a local stout into a global symbol of heritage, its dark foam bottled and canned with nitrogen to replicate the draft experience anywhere in the world. By the 1950s, beer had outgrown its geography. Cans changed everything. When the first pressurized aluminum beer can appeared in 1935, it was seen as a novelty. Lighter than glass, easier to ship, and impossible to shatter. But after the war, with aluminum production ramped up for aircraft manufacturing, it became the container of the modern age. Soldiers had learned to trust cans. They were portable, safe, uniform. Now, those same men, returning home, found their supermarkets lined with neat metallic rows of Budweiser, Schlitz, and Coors. The pop-top became a sound of freedom and familiarity. Cold beer had become the reward for peace. But this convenience came with a trade-off. The shift from glass to can, from local pub to global market, changed the meaning of beer itself. For thousands of years it had been brewed for the people who drank it, flavoured by local water, local grain, and the taste memory of a place. Now it was brewed for consistency. Every sip had to taste the same in St. Louis as it did in Stockholm. To achieve that, brewers filtered more, pasteurised longer, and standardised recipes until variety became risk. The yeast was controlled, the bitterness calibrated, and the alcohol content reduced to please the widest possible audience. The result was the birth of the international lager, light, neutral, and polite. Advertising stepped in to fill the space that flavour left behind. The mid-20th century was the golden age of beer marketing. Radio jingles, billboards, and eventually television campaigns turned beer from a drink into an identity. Men were told that a brand could define their masculinity, their leisure, even their patriotism. Slogans like "This bud's for you" or "Heineken refreshes the parts. Other beers cannot reach" became cultural mantras. Beer was no longer about taste or tradition. It was about belonging. Commercials presented beer as the liquid language of companionship. Men laughed around campfires or polished cars in driveways, their smiles glistening in golden hour light. In these carefully staged scenes, beer was both the product and the prize. What had once been a sacred, gender-neutral act, brewing, became part of the masculine identity of the industrial age. Women, who had once been the world's first brewers, were now absent from the narrative, reappearing only in advertisements as symbols of domesticity or desire. Technology reinforced the illusion of abundance. In breweries, automation replaced handcraft. Conveyor belts, carbon dioxide pressurization, and large steel fermentation tanks allowed millions of litres to be produced with minimal human touch. The beer master of old, part artist, part chemist, was replaced by industrial engineers and logistics managers. Brewing was no longer about intuition. It was about mathematics. Even refrigeration carried cultural weight. The phrase ice-cold beer became synonymous with modern luxury. Before refrigeration, beer was served cellar-cool, never icy. But the new advertising world equated coldness with cleanliness, modernity, and purity. The frost on the bottle became a visual metaphor, cold as civilization, predictable as progress. Yet, ironically, this obsession with temperature dulled taste. Flavour molecules are less volatile when cold, and the colder the beer, the less distinct it becomes. Drinkers were encouraged to chill their beer not for flavour, but to hide its absence. As breweries expanded, local ones disappeared. By the 1960s, most independent brewers in North America and Western Europe had been absorbed or eliminated. In the United States, fewer than 100 large companies produced almost all the beer consumed nationwide. Distribution networks became so efficient that diversity was no longer economical. It was the same pattern that would later appear in fast food, music and television. The standardization of pleasure. Even architecture changed. The neighborhood pub, once a center of conversation and community, gave way to chain bars and sports venues. Beer drinking shifted from a communal ritual into a solitary or televised one, a reward for labor, not an act of gathering. The pint glass and the six-pack were no longer symbols of craft or friendship, but of lifestyle. Meanwhile, global brands turned their attention outward. As decolonization reshaped Africa, Asia and Latin America, breweries followed new markets. Companies built factories in Nigeria, Mexico and Indonesia, adapting the same light lager to tropical climates. The uniform taste of the Western beer became a passport of modernity. Drinking it signalled entry into the global economy. Yet in these new markets, local fermentation traditions, millet beer, rice wine, palm toddy, were slowly displaced by imports. A golden tide swept across continents, leaving behind fewer flavours but stronger logos. In post-war Europe, the same process took a softer, subtler form. The Marshall Plan encouraged economic rebuilding through American-style production models. Breweries embraced efficiency, packaging, and international branding. Beer was no longer an agricultural product, it was a technological one. The culture of moderation and festivity that once surrounded it thinned into marketing promises of relaxation and reward. But underneath the glamour and growth, something else was fermenting. A quiet unease. Drinkers who had grown up before the wars remembered a time when beer tasted of fields and hands, not machines. Travellers noticed that no matter where they went, every beer tasted nearly the same. It was convenient, yes, but uncanny. The drink that had once defined place now erased it. This was the paradox of progress. In making beer everywhere, humanity had made it belong nowhere. The same technological miracles that had preserved yeast, standardized recipes, and ensured safety also stripped beer of its local soul. The industrial era had finally completed what Prohibition had begun, the separation of drink from identity. And yet, even within this sameness, the memory of flavour lingered, faint but indestructible. Somewhere in Denmark, a brewer still tended his yeast culture like a living heirloom. In Ireland, Guinness guarded its strain as a national treasure. In Mexico, local lagers began to adapt lime and salt to regional taste. In Japan, Asahi and Kirin experimented with precision and restraint, creating lagers that mirrored national aesthetics of minimalism and purity. The world had not stopped fermenting, it had just changed its rhythm. By the end of the 1960s, beer had become a mirror of modern civilization, efficient, global, and profoundly impersonal. A can of beer could now travel farther and last longer than the people who made it. Advertising promised it would bring connection, but it mostly delivered convenience. The taste of humanity's oldest communal invention had been engineered into predictability. Yet, if you looked closer at the bubbles rising in a glass, at the quiet chemistry still unfolding inside each can, you could still see the miracle that began 12,000 years earlier in a Natufian cave, yeast turning sugar into something more than itself. Even at its most industrial, beer still carried a trace of the same biological wonder that once made early humans stop, taste, and share. What was lost was not the drink itself, but the context, the stories, the rituals, the sense that every sip connected you to a place and a people. What remained was the machinery, humming like a heartbeat of a planet that had turned its oldest art into an industry. But beneath that noise, the yeast of culture was still alive, waiting quietly for rediscovery. Imagine this, a garage lit by a single hanging bulb, the smell of malt and hops swirling in the air. A man in the corner is stirring a bubbling pot on a repurposed stove, watching steam rise like history itself reclaiming its flavour. Outside, the world hums with the monotony of sameness. The same beer, the same taste, the same commercials. But in here, something ancient is waking up again. It's the 1970s, and the rebellion against blandness has begun. After nearly half a century of industrial uniformity, a quiet revolt started in basements, kitchens, and small-town garages. People were not just tired of mass-produced lagers. They were nostalgic for taste, for texture, for story. Beer had once been regional, alive with yeast and soil and time. Now it was corporate and sterile. But the post-war generation, raised on uniformity, began craving difference. What began as homebrewing, often illegal, improvised, and deeply personal, evolved into a cultural movement. It was not about intoxication, but restoration. In the United States, the first sparks appeared in the 1960s and 70s, when a handful of enthusiasts began experimenting with brewing at home, rediscovering recipes that had vanished after Prohibition. In 1978, American President Jimmy Carter legalized homebrewing at the federal level, and suddenly, kitchens became laboratories of experimentation. Across California, Oregon, and Colorado, a generation of self-taught brewers began treating beer not as a product, but as art. These early pioneers had little more than curiosity and stubbornness. They read old British manuals, hunted down obscure yeast strains, and begged hop farmers for varieties that had nearly disappeared. Their names, Ken Grossman, Fritz Maytag, Jack McAuliffe, would later become legendary in the brewing world, but at the time they were just tinkerers following aroma. Sierra Nevada, Anchor Steam, New Albion. These weren't corporations, they were experiments in flavour. The beers they made were cloudy, intense, alive. People who tried them said they tasted like something that had memory. Meanwhile, in Europe, the same thing was happening, though for different reasons. In Belgium, small family breweries that had survived the wars were rediscovered by young drinkers seeking authenticity. Trappist ales, lambics, and farmhouse saisons, long considered relics of rural life, were suddenly exotic and complex to urban palates. In Britain, the Campaign for Real Ale, or CAMRA, launched in 1971, defending cask-conditioned ale against the onslaught of filtered pasteurised lagers. Their slogan, simple and revolutionary, was that beer should be alive. By the 1980s, the movement had a name, craft beer. The term didn't mean small for the sake of small, it meant flavour with intention. A backlash against sameness, it reintroduced bitterness, aroma, and locality. Hops, once hidden behind industrial neutrality, became front and centre. Brewers began seeking out forgotten varieties, Cascade, Centennial, Amarillo, each with its own chemistry of oils and acids, capable of producing citrus, pine, or floral notes. The science of brewing turned creative again, not just precise. At the heart of this revolution was one style, the India Pale Ale. Once a colonial relic, IPA became the perfect symbol for rediscovery. Strong, aromatic, unapologetic. It embodied what people had lost: intensity, individuality, and risk. Its revival in the 1990s ignited a hop renaissance that transformed beer chemistry itself. Botanists and agricultural scientists began breeding new hybrids, manipulating the balance of alpha acids and terpenes to create flavours never seen before. Mango, grapefruit, passion fruit, resin, even diesel-like bitterness. The ancient yeast-grain partnership met modern genetics, and for the first time in centuries the world's palate expanded outward again. But the craft movement wasn't just about taste, it was about meaning. In a world growing increasingly global and automated, small breweries became islands of locality. Every pint glass became an act of resistance against sameness. Labels featured mountains, rivers, street names, a reminder that beer, at its core, had always been a reflection of place. Farmers and brewers began collaborating again, closing the loop between soil and glass. Grain was malted locally, hops grown regionally, and yeast cultured from the air itself. By the early 2000s, this quiet revolution had become a cultural force. Cities once dominated by a few global brands now had microbreweries on every corner. Tap rooms replaced bars. Menus listed not just beer names but brewing notes, ingredients, even the altitude where the hops were grown. Beer tastings became social rituals, the same curiosity that once built 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 and fueled medieval monks now turned toward the chemistry of foam. The economics of beer changed too. Consumers who had grown up with $1 lagers were suddenly willing to pay 5 times more for a handcrafted ale. It wasn't just about alcohol content, it was about authenticity. Each sip was a small rebellion against industrial anonymity. The labels became artistic statements: matte paper, hand-drawn fonts, surreal illustrations, rejecting glossy perfection in favour of texture. Even the science evolved with the art. Microbiologists began sequencing yeast genomes to explore how tiny differences in metabolism could produce radical changes in flavour. Breweries hired chemists and sensory analysts. The line between brewery and laboratory blurred once again, this time not in the service of standardization but of diversity. The ancient invisible magic of yeast became a modern playground of experimentation. Wild fermentation, barrel aging, and spontaneous inoculation became modern echoes of ancient mistakes. The same accidents that once birthed beer 12,000 years earlier in the caves of the Levant. The craft movement was not without irony. As it grew, it inevitably began to mirror what it had rebelled against. Successful microbreweries expanded into regional empires, and multinational corporations began buying them, absorbing rebellion into profit. But for a few decades, beer truly rediscovered itself. It remembered that fermentation was not a process. It was a relationship. Each country expressed it differently. In Japan, small brewers brought precision and purity to the art, merging Zen minimalism with Western experimentation. In Scandinavia, breweries like Nuinö and Mikkeller treated beer as philosophy, pushing boundaries of alcohol, sweetness, and acidity. In the United States, the West Coast IPA became the cultural archetype, aggressive, aromatic, and proudly bitter, while the East Coast countered with hazy, juicy, opaque brews that looked more like nectar than beer. Europe, long the keeper of tradition, responded by rediscovering its forgotten corners: Polish Grodziskie, Finnish Sahti, and German Goes. The world's beer map, once flattened, began fracturing into vibrant colour again, and behind it all, a subtle emotional thread ran through the foam, the longing for connection. Craft beer culture wasn't just about flavour, it was about conversation. It reintroduced slowness into a world of instant gratification. People gathered again around wooden tables talking about yeast strains and water hardness the way their ancestors once spoke about harvests and gods. The brewery became the new campfire, the modern circle where humans once again remembered that they could create warmth through sharing. It is difficult to measure what was recovered. Beer did not become better, that's a matter of taste. But it became human again. The act of drinking returned to its social and cultural roots, woven back into the story of place, memory, and experimentation. Breweries no longer aim to please everyone, they aim to express someone, a city, a season, a person's idea of balance. In that sense, the craft movement reconnected beer to the story of human curiosity, the same curiosity that led the first Natufian hunter-gatherers to taste fermented grain and wonder what it meant. By the 21st century, the movement had matured into a paradox. On one hand, craft brewing became mainstream, festivals, magazines, even university programs. On the other, it retained its small-scale ethos, taste as storytelling, brewing as archaeology. To brew was to remember that progress is not always forward. Sometimes it loops back through forgotten recipes and rediscovered microbes. Today, every sip of a double IPA, stout or farmhouse ale carries the DNA of that rebellion. A reminder that the history of beer is not just about alcohol, but awareness. Each bubble is a fragment of our evolutionary relationship with fermentation, our oldest symbiosis. The yeast never stopped evolving, and neither did we. The difference is that, for a while, we forgot how to taste it. Perhaps that is what truly woke the world's palate again. Not novelty, but memory. The recognition that beneath all the machinery, the marketing, and the modern noise, the same ancient partnership between human and microbe still hums quietly in every brew. And once you taste that, really taste it, it's impossible not to feel connected again to the long, strange fermentation that made us who we are. A bar with no smell of alcohol, no sound of bottles clinking, no dizziness in the laughter, just conversation. Screens glow softly behind the counter, tracking temperature, CO2 levels, and the fermentation of something that technically never ferments. The bartender or perhaps brewer pours a golden drink that looks exactly like beer. It froths, sparkles, and settles with a familiar sigh. But its yeast has been reprogrammed, its alcohol never formed. It's not a compromise, it's a choice. Welcome to the first era in human history where intoxication is optional. Across the planet, a quiet revolution is reshaping our oldest ritual. In cities from Copenhagen to Seoul, non-alcoholic craft beer is no longer an oxymoron. Startups and traditional breweries alike are reinventing the chemistry of pleasure, using precision fermentation, genetically edited yeasts, and vacuum distillation. They're removing ethanol from the process entirely, not by dilution, but by redesign. Some replace yeast with lab-engineered microbes that mimic its metabolic pathways without producing alcohol at all. Others use AI-controlled fermenters that monitor aroma compounds in real time, adjusting temperature and pressure the way a musician tunes an instrument mid-song. What drives this shift isn't prohibition or moral panic, it's curiosity and change. Younger generations are drinking less, not because they fear alcohol, but because they've inherited an overstimulated world. Sleep is scarce, clarity is rare, and health has become the new rebellion. In a strange way, the decision to remove alcohol from beer has the same impulse that once created it, the search for balance between body and mind. Only now the goal is not escape, but presence. Yet the act of brewing remains as ancient as ever. The same enzymes still crack the same starches. The same malted grains still release their sugars into warm, fragrant wort. The difference is intention. Where our ancestors stumbled upon fermentation by accident, we now orchestrate it molecule by molecule. A modern brewer can simulate the aromatic profile of a Belgian ale, the bitterness curve of a West Coast IPA, or the smooth body of a stout, all without ethanol. It's chemistry as memory, reproducing the flavour of intoxication without its cost. In the background, climate science is forcing another transformation. Barley, the heart of most beer, is struggling under rising temperatures and erratic rainfall. Some fields that once fed Europe's great breweries now yield unpredictable harvests, or grains with altered protein ratios. Brewers are experimenting with drought-resistant varieties like triticale, sorghum, and millet, plants once confined to subsistence farming now re-entering the global stage. Laboratories in Denmark and New Zealand are sequencing barley genomes to select lines that thrive with less water and fewer pesticides. Even wastewater from breweries, once a pollutant, is being recycled, filtered, and reused, sometimes to brew the next batch. Energy, too, is part of the reckoning. Beer is one of the most energy-intensive beverages to produce. from malting and boiling to chilling and packaging. Some breweries now run entirely on solar arrays, others capture the CO2 released during fermentation to carbonate later batches, closing the loop. Artificial intelligence predicts heat losses, yeast vitality, and even future demand, allowing the process to evolve from intuition into precision. We are teaching machines to preserve an ancient ritual, and perhaps that is the most human thing of all, delegating routine so we can keep the meaning. Still, the emotional core remains. Whether alcoholic or not, beer continues to play the same role it always has, a medium for connection. In every era, it has reflected what people needed most: warmth, courage, relief, celebration, or sleep. Now, in an age of overstimulation, it offers calm. Cafes once dominated by caffeine are giving way to taprooms serving near 0% ales, where people linger in conversation without fog. Breweries host yoga sessions, mindfulness events, and acoustic concerts, reminders that intoxication was never only chemical. At the frontier of this evolution is biotechnology. Scientists at universities in Singapore and Munich are developing yeasts that can convert barley sugars into aromatic compounds without generating ethanol. Others are experimenting with programmable microbes that produce specific terpenes, the same molecules found in hops, citrus, and pine. This allows brewers to adjust aroma digitally, swapping physical hops for biohops created in a lab. It's controversial, of course. Purists argue that it erases the agricultural soul of beer. But supporters see it as the next logical step: sustainable flavour without environmental cost. Imagine a world where your favourite beer doesn't depend on a single harvest, but on a database of microbial recipes. You could download a stout brewed with yeast that once lived on a cocoa farm in Ghana, or an IPA fermented with bioengineered yeast that mimics the aroma of New Zealand hops, without shipping a single cone across the ocean. The beer industry, born from rivers and clay, is turning into an ecosystem of code, and yet every sip still begins with the same miracle: sugar transformed by life into something more than itself. For some brewers, the future means scaling that miracle down again. Nanobreweries, smaller than microbreweries, are emerging inside apartment buildings, using closed-loop fermenters the size of a suitcase. An AI interface adjusts timing, carbonation, and bitterness for each user, creating personalized flavor profiles based on biometric feedback. Your smartwatch knows when you're stressed. Your fermenter knows what kind of beer might soothe you. The line between nutrition, emotion, and ritual is blurring. In the laboratories of the 21st century, fermentation is also teaching us about ourselves. Researchers studying yeast metabolism are uncovering new insights into cellular aging, energy efficiency, and even neurological reward systems. Every yeast cell in a vat of beer is a biological time machine, a direct descendant of microbes that shaped human evolution. We share genes with these organisms, not metaphorically but literally, and the way they turn energy into pleasure might not be so different from how our brains process joy, memory, or music. To study fermentation is to study the boundaries of consciousness itself. As alcohol consumption declines in many parts of the world, the cultural meaning of cheers is shifting. It's no longer just a toast to celebration, but a gesture of gratitude for the experience, the flavour, the company, the moment. Beer without alcohol still carries the essence of its lineage: community. The bubbles still rise, the conversation still slows, and for a few minutes, the noise of life softens. But the deeper question remains: what does it mean for a species to step away from intoxication? For tens of millennia, alcohol has been our mirror, reflecting both our creativity and our excess. It fueled art, architecture, and religion, but also addiction and collapse. Now, as we consciously redesign our relationship with it, we're also testing the limits of what it means to be human. Are we evolving past the need for altered states, or simply reinventing them through different tools, technology, meditation, virtual reality? Maybe fermentation itself was never just about the drink, but about transformation. The universal human desire to turn chaos into order, raw matter into meaning. There's a quiet poetry in how it's come full circle, from wild yeast drifting through the air of a cave to AI-regulated fermenters humming in clean laboratories. The process remains a collaboration between biology and imagination. Whether we still call it beer or something else in the future doesn't matter as much as the impulse behind it. The urge to mix, to share, to taste. Perhaps the future will not be defined by what we brew, but by how we remember why we brewed in the first place. Fermentation, in the end, has always been a metaphor for life itself. Growth through decay, creation through letting go. Even in a post-alcohol world, that rhythm continues quietly in the background, bubbling unseen, shaping the way we connect, celebrate and rest. So, if someday our descendants raise a glass of perfectly clear, perfectly non-intoxicating liquid and say cheers, they'll still be echoing an ancient instinct, the desire to pause together in time, to honour the invisible chemistry that made us social, emotional and endlessly curious creatures. Thank you, fellow Sapiens, for wandering this timeline with me, for drifting into deep time, for slowing down and remembering. If this helped you fall asleep, helped you study, or simply helped you step out of the noise for a while, thank you for being here. If you think more people should know this story, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it with the Sapiens in your life, and tell me, are you listening before bed, while working, or somewhere in the world I can only imagine? And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.